Okay, I think that we should be good to go.
All right, I'll get everybody started here. Good morning, committee members, OWEB staff, all of you who are joining us for today's meeting. My name is Russ Hoflick, and I am co-chair of the Acquisition, Restoration, and Emerging Issues Committee with Dan Brown. And we want to remind everyone that this is a virtual meeting and is being live streamed on OWEB's YouTube channel and recorded. For those on Zoom, we discourage using the chat functions since it is not visible to our YouTube audience. Before we get started, we'd like all the committee members and OWEB staff and guests to introduce themselves. And I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. You could probably see it better than we can on your screens, multiple screens.
Yes, I'll call on you, and then if you can introduce yourself for the record. Let's start with our co-chairs, Russ and then Dan.
Sure, Russ Hoflick, co-chair, member at large.
Good morning, folks. My name is Dan Brown. I represent the Environmental Protection Agency on the OWEB board, and I co-chair this committee with Russ.
Thank you. Let's go Mark Webb and then Jamie, please.
Hey there, Mark Webb. I'm the Environmental Quality Commission liaison for the OWEB board.
Good morning, Jamie McLeod Skinner, member at large based in Central Oregon.
Okay, thank you. We will skip to OWEB staff now. Sarah and then Renee, please.
Hi, friends. Sarah O'Brien, OWEB's Executive Director. Good to see everybody today.
Good morning, everyone. Renee Davis, OWEB's Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager.
Thank you. Miriam and then Robin and then Brian, please.
Good morning, Miriam Forney, OWEB's Land Acquisition Coordinator.
Hi, everyone. Robin Meacher. I'm the Conservation Easement Specialist in the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program at OWEB.
Good morning, everyone. Brian Walcott. I'm the Water Acquisitions Grants Coordinator and also the Capacity Grants Coordinator.
Eric Williams, and then we'll go to Diane Lloyd.
Good morning, everyone. Eric Williams, OWEB's Restoration Grants Program Manager.
And good morning. I'm Diane Lloyd with the Oregon Department of Justice, and I'm contact counsel to OWEB.
And I am the last staff member, Nicole Bettinardi. I am the executive assistant and board liaison. Now, we'd like to introduce have our public introduce themselves. So I will call on you, please. And if you can introduce yourself, if you are interested to. Natasha and then Carson on my screen.
Good morning. My name is Natasha Bellis. I'm the Conservation Director with Deschutes Land Trust.
And good morning, Carson Kendrick. I'm the Conservation Director for the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts.
Thank you. Joe, then Jessica, please.
Morning, everyone. Joe Buttafuoco, Executive Director of Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts.
Hey, everybody. Jessica McDonald, Executive Director at Greenbelt Land Trust.
Thank you. And then I have Matthew and Marty, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, all. Matthew Bearden with Department of Environmental Quality with the Water Integration Team.
Hi, I'm Amanda Martino, or Marty. I'm the Executive Director at Blue Mountain Land Trust.
I believe that's all on my screen. So Russ, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, Dan, why don't you just take us through a quick review of the agenda for today?
Sounds great, Russ. First item on the agenda is going to be our public comments, and Nicole will help us with that when we get there. We want to thank folks who already submitted written comments. Joe Buttafuoco from CULT, Mark Hudson from PFT, and Mark McLaughlin from NCLC. For those folks that are interested, all those public comments and all the meeting materials are on the OWEB website, and you can find them by navigating to the OWEB committees. And then you scroll down to this Acquisition and Restoration Committee, and then finally this specific meeting. Oh, and by the way, when you tell your friends about the energy and excitement of today's meeting, I'm sure they're going to want to watch it, and you can tell them that the rerun will be available on the website at some point in the future
You can
as
binge
well.
you can binge watch the whole series on YouTube. It's a great weekend.
There you go. Yeah.
Free of
Thank you,
charge,
Sarah.
right?
The second item in our on our agenda today is a brief orientation to the grant-related items that are going to be discussed at the full board meeting in April, right around the corner. And then Renee and Sarah are going to catch us up on where we are in the modernization process. And then that will lead into agenda item 4, which is going to be a discussion about the foundational question related to significant habitat in future conditions. And then agenda item 5 is a discussion of ideas for program refinements and early thoughts on this committee's recommendations to the board. 6 is a preview of this subcommittee's June meeting, including additional discussion on other foundational questions. And then finally, we will wrap up. What I did not see on the agenda is a bio break.
I was just gonna say that, Dan. You guys may choose to send us on a bio break when you think it's appropriate, maybe in the 10 to 10:30 region.
Okay.
That's exactly kind of what I was thinking. And with that, Nicole, why don't you start us off with the public comments, if you don't mind?
My pleasure. If anybody on our meeting right now would like to provide public comment, if you can raise your Zoom hand, and then I will call you in order. Perfect. Let's start with Joe, please. I will start the, we have 3 minutes, and I will start the timer on my little Zoom app thing. So if you're ready to go, Joe, I will start it.
Thanks, Chair Hoflich, Chair Brown, members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to provide public comment today. For the record, I'm Joe Buttafuoco, Executive Director of Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. Thank you all for the continued work and commitment to these discussions. Wanted to join today just to continue the conversation we had in December on desired future conditions and significant habitats. Land trusts aren't just asking OWEB to trust us blindly. What we're trying to convey is that accredited land trusts are built for the purpose to manage conservation properties in perpetuity, along with the associated risks, and they have expertise to bring good projects and deliver results. They've also built strong expertise in implementing impactful restoration projects. We see ourselves as instrumental partners to achieving the intentions of Measure 76. OWEB's current approach introduces unnecessary barriers. It locks desired future conditions into grant funding and holds land trusts to achieving those conditions on a property before they even own it, and can really spend the time needed to understand the property, plan the restoration work, and implement it. Our land trusts are considering the conservation potential of a property, including whether restoration will enhance this potential when they're pursuing the acquisition. We expect that OWEB is considering the current and potential habitat benefits of each project to make funding decisions. But is it fair to ask applicants to lay out restoration plans and be held to them with the potential of penalties before they even know if the project will happen? The timeline for grant expectations should be adaptable to the larger context land trusts are working in to accommodate shifts in planning or negotiations that may be needed with neighbors or other agencies. The example from the Sayusla estuary described for you in December, also in written testimony from Mackenzie River Trust, shows how OWEB's approach to risk management complicated an important land acquisition. Because of concerns about a previous project's incomplete restoration work, a new opportunity in the same priority area was passed by, only to be picked up again 5 years later for fewer acres at much greater expense. This program represents an incredible opportunity. It has excellent staff and leadership and commitment from this committee and board. The ecological challenges ahead of us grow by the day. We're ready to move into the solution space with you all and are excited to hear what OWEB is proposing during the meeting today. Thanks so much for your time and commitment. That's all.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Okie dokie. Let's go to Natasha, please, and then Jessica.
Good morning, co-chairs Hoflick and Brown and members of the ARE committee. My name is Natasha Bellis. I'm the conservation director at Deschutes Land Trust based in Bend. Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide comment this morning and for all your work these last many months in exploring how to modernize OWEB's land acquisition program. Your time and dedication are really appreciated. In this second foundational question, asking if OWEB's land acquisition program should incorporate an expectation of active restoration of properties acquired, we agree with submitted and stated comments of our Land Trust colleagues and would also like to offer to committee members that they take a hard look at the tools OWEB already has to help staff evaluate if an acquisition application will lead to the protection of significant habitats. And I'm referring here to the report Ecological Priorities for Land Acquisition by Basin, which identifies high priority ecological attributes for each major drainage basin in Oregon, and specifically states that focusing on applications that address these attributes will help ensure that land acquisition projects provide significant ecological benefits in support of OWEB's mission. This report identifies priority species and habitats and conservation principles as the key attributes that will indicate a project's ecological benefits. While restoration is mentioned as a key part of 2 conservation principles, it is absent from a description of the remaining 5, meaning that restoration is not a key part of the conservation principle. Notably, the term desired future conditions does not appear anywhere in the report. I'd like to encourage this OWEB committee to take another look at this report and consider how well it is integrated into the current land acquisition application and how the attributes are evaluated in the application. In our experience, restoration or desired future conditions has an outsized influence in the application and evaluation process. I want to be clear that I'm not advocating that restoration never be part of the consideration for a land acquisition application. I think sometimes it's necessary, and the Land Trust had such a project in our Ochako Preserve, which but for restoration would be 2 pivot fills at the confluence of 2 very important lower Crooked River tributaries. Restoration provided the ecological benefit here, but is not the case in all or even most projects. The OWEB application and review process needs to find balance. I would also like to point out that a property can simultaneously qualify as a priority project because it supports listed conservation principles and priority species or habitats and stand to benefit from future restoration. In the landscapes where land trusts work, few properties are achieving their full conservation potential at the time of application, largely due to historic land use. But land trust ownership of property will per se change the management to achieve more ecological outcomes. And it will do this because that's what we do. It's our stated 501c3 charitable purpose. We support OWEB's interest in understanding restoration potential and desired future conditions because it's valuable information. However, we suggest this input is limited to the situations it most applies to and as a tool to inform management planning rather than as a determining factor in project merit funding as is. Thanks for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to turn the sound off. Thank you, Natasha. Jessica.
Chair Hoflick, Chair Brown, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide comment today. For the record, again, my name is Jessica McDonald. I am the Executive Director at Greenbelt Land Trust. And today I wanted to provide some thoughts as you move into discussions around other uses on conserved lands. So OWEB has historically interpreted Measure 76 to mean that access to conserved land should be restricted in order to safeguard a property's sensitive habitats. This interpretation has filtered through acquisition application decisions, preconditions for funding, conservation easement, and management plan restrictions and language. And this philosophical understanding relies on the assumption that people being on the land is at odds with conservation, that human presence is a liability to ecological integrity. Now, in September, you heard from my colleague Claire Fox about a property that was awarded funding by OWEB that our land trust made a really difficult decision to remove from a funding partnership due to signs indicating that our plans for an inclusive trail through the property would not align with OWEB's goals and acquisition conditions. The committee also heard from an esteemed tribal panel in December about the dynamic interrelationship between access, cultural sovereignty, and restorative relationships to the land, and that it is indeed only through direct, regular contact with the land that those lands and waters can remain healthy. While admittedly and humbly late to this lesson, land trusts have evolved. Today, we recognize that fortress conservation is short-sighted, that the binary of humans versus nature is a construct, and we believe that cultural uses are conservation. It is critical that OWEB investigate the relationship between recreation, cultural use, and people on the land in its recreation and, in its acquisition program. We can look to OWEB's own strategic plan for guidance, aligning to the agency's core belief that a community's economic and social health derives not only from the health of the lands that surround them, but also from the community's ability to draw enjoyment from clean water, open spaces, and natural habitats. Let's also look to the voices of those whose leadership formed Measure 66 and 76, shared by that influential panel for the first ARE meeting back last June, I think. I hear Nan Evans and Bruce Taylor describing how the measure was intended to be flexible and allow for evolution over time. I hear Kathy McDonald saying that in 1998, it was prudent to operate with an abundance of caution, but now there is capacity, urgency, and demand that we become more risk tolerant and take leaps of faith. I hope that this evolution, that these leaps of faith will include an expanded view of conservation, one where we shift from the perception that human presence on the land is an act of encroachment to one of potential stewardship. Thank you again for the time to comment today, and I really appreciate your dedication and commitment to these conversations.
Thank you, Jessica. I'd like to make one more call. If anybody else would like to provide public comment, if you can raise your Zoom hand now. Okay, seeing none, we do have another committee member has arrived. I would like to introduce Kelly. Kelly, could you introduce yourself for the record, please?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Kelly Coates, I'm the tribal representative on the OWEB board, and then my day job is the Natural Resources Director for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians. I apologize for being late this morning. It was a back-to-back meeting kind of morning.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all public commenters for participating today. Russ and Dan, I will hand it back to you.
And I think we'll hand it over to whoever's given us the orientation on the grant-related items at the board meeting.
Yep, thanks, Dan.
Renee, thank you.
Yep, I'll orient us briefly again for the record. Renee Davis, Acquisition and Special Programs Manager. So we have 3 brief updates, about 5 minutes each, given the very full agenda we have of 3 grant award decisions that will be in front of the board during the April board meeting. We'll start with Robin Meacher. She'll talk with you about the Oregon Ag Heritage Conservation Easement Grant Cycle that we're wrapping up now. We'll then go to Miriam Forney to talk about the land acquisition grant cycle, and then Brian Wolcott will talk with you about the water acquisition grant cycle. So given where we are with the timing of this meeting relative to the grant cycles themselves, we will give you a sense of the applications that came in the door and the review process themselves. We will not be talking through funding lines, just giving the very early timing of this committee meeting, but just wanted to give you a sneak preview. So with that, Robin, would you give us an update about OHP?
Yes, and I'm going to share, hopefully, my screen. How's that? Okay.
Looks good.
Thanks. So as Renee mentioned, Robin Meacher, I'm the Conservation Easement Specialist on the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program. So I manage the Working Lands Conservation Easement grants. And there we go. So our grants, I just want to kind of ground us in the purpose because we do have statutory and rule-based requirements for what these conservation easements are intended to accomplish. And so those purposes are to protect the continued use of a working land for agricultural purposes, while also maintaining or enhancing fish or wildlife habitat, maintaining or enhancing water quality, and maintaining or enhancing other natural resource values. And our program has a whole host of evaluation criteria that kind of get to how does each proposal address these main categories for protection under the program. So this time we had a funding cycle. The applications were closed in November of last year, and we had about $1.76 million available. We received 6 applications requesting in total about $2.8 million from OWEB. And so as you can see, demand is larger than what we have available. We've been in the process, our review process, which I'll go into a little bit in depth because it's different. And we have a kind of intermediary body, which I'll give just a minor touch point on when we get there. So these are our 6 applications. These are not in ranked order. This is just order of how they came into the system. So as Renee mentioned, the funding line has not been released yet. We did get a wonderful variation across the state, which is always really great to see. We see different regions, different habitat types, different agricultural operations. And it's a really great just kind of information gathering as well to see what's happening across the state, both in terms of working lands conservation and then the commitment of our organizations as they work on blending those 2 purposes in the program. I'm not going to go into depth about any one of the applications, but I'm happy to answer questions if folks have them a little bit later. Hopefully this map comes through. I realize it's a lot of white on white on white. But this is just demonstrating, again, that geographical distribution of our applications that came in, had everything up from up on the North Columbia down into Jackson County, and then over in our Northeast area, part of the state, and then Central Oregon as well. So again, great distribution. So now a bit about our process and what we go through before you'll see these in the April board meeting. So again, we have applications come in, staff do our general eligibility screening and work through collating all of the applications that come in. And then we have a review committee that is statutorily and based in rule. So all of our applications are run through a committee of technical experts that evaluate all of the applications based off of how well they meet our varied application criteria. I think last we counted, we have 26 that need to be addressed in the review. So it's pretty extensive. We have a great review committee that this is our 3rd solicitation for the program. So we've got some repeat members that are getting really familiar with what they're seeing. And they do review all applications and then rank them amongst each other. So that is a core part of how our review team works and is, again, a statutorily and then rule-based process. So we work within that. And then based off of our review team's conversations, evaluations, and ranking, we put together a staff recommendation that is a summary of their evaluation for each project and then their ranked list. And then that goes to the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Commission, which is again another statutorily established body that has a much larger role in the program than just reviewing conservation easement grant recommendations. They are a body that essentially works on all parts of the program. But so all of our evaluations and that funding line ranking goes to the commission, who then considers those and makes the formal recommendation for funding for the board. So that goes through the commission meeting, which we have scheduled in mid-March. And then after their deliberations, they'll develop the recommendations for funding that then staff carry to the board in April. So again, we've got that intermediary process. It essentially goes through 2 reviews. Each of our applications, we have our review committee that does it, and then it goes to the commission for kind of a second look, but also strong consideration as they're required of the technical committee's ranking and evaluation. And then it gets to come to the board for award, which is always the fun part. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to sit here for questions.
And Dan, maybe before we go to questions, just big thanks to Robin and also Taylor Larson, our OHP coordinator. They had a very fast timeline for this grant cycle, given interest in quickly turning around the funding that was allocated during last long legislative session for OHP. So thanks to both of them for the great work.
Go ahead, Jamie. Sorry.
Oh, not all. Russ, did you have your hand up first? You look like you're.
No, you go for it, Jamie.
Great. Well, thanks for the great presentation. A question that came to mind in the early part of your presentation was the fact the state legislature has been exploring opportunities to expand housing development. And so I'm just curious, as we're considering criteria, are all the, and I'm forgetting this about the criteria, is everything outside of UGBs, and does staff anticipate any conflicts with the push for potential land acquisition projects for our purposes, for OWIP's purposes, being in conflict with housing development?
I'll give a brief answer to that just on how the program currently looks at it, and then I'll let Sarah and Renee weigh in on any kind of more future-looking policy. So we look at that in a couple ways. The commission has grappled with that question in both of its rulemaking cycles. I wasn't there for the first one in 2017 when they laid out the initial rules and evaluation criteria, but our most recent one in 2025, they did kind of revisit that question of, do we want to do a carte blanche, just nothing within a UGB is eligible? Do we want to have some variation on how we look at that? So it is still technically eligible if something comes in. And then it factors into our evaluation criteria specifically in that we have one that asks if it's consistent with local plans. So that kind of takes into the local communities, housing plans, and other goals too, wildlife goals, farming goals, all of those things. So we do ask our applicants to address that. And then we have a wonderful technical committee member who I think is a literal encyclopedia on land use. And so we get the benefit of their review on that as well. So we do see some come in really, really close to UGBs, if not somewhat overlapping. And so those eval criteria do factor in.
Thank you. And if I could make apologies to any folks listening, urban growth boundaries, UGB, I jumped to the acronyms, and that's on me. And then also there is a current rulemaking process that's looking at some of those. So just flagging that for potential conflicts.
Great. Thanks, Jamie.
Go ahead, Russ.
Robin, just a real simple question here. I see some familiar names in the list of projects that are coming forward, and I'm assuming that these are either second, third, or fourth phases of projects that already have been funded by OWEB. I was curious how you factor in or prioritize projects that are in sequences as they are presented to you for review.
Yeah, good point. I'm glad you brought that up because you'll see that. So kind of two reasons why you're seeing familiar names. Yes, the phasing is something that we saw. You'll see it throughout conservation projects. So we do have some that are second phases of previously funded OHP projects, and I'll talk a little bit about how we look at phasing in a second. And then the other is that we have 4 out of the 6 applications were resubmits. So as you saw with the funding available versus funding requested, I think this is going to be something the program would consistently see, in that we have projects developed. They have funding through another partner, either through NRCS or other match funders. And so when we have funding available, if those projects are still viable, we'll probably see them come back through as resubmits. And so we did see that this time. And then it also gives folks, as they have the chance to kind of review previous applications and those evaluations, to see how to tighten up or additional information that might bring their application to rank better in another cycle. So that's kind of 2 reasons why you're seeing familiar names. And then the second one, yes, the phasing. So a couple of these, the Sealy Mint Farm is a second phase. It's family members with adjacent land. And so that's a phase. And then Aspen Valley is a phase project as well. So this is the third of a 2 that had already been funded. So we do encourage our review committee members to look at projects both in the context of how they stand on their own, recognizing that phasing is a wonderful idea and it's great when it comes to fruition, but we can't control the future. And if a project at previous phase hasn't closed yet, there's still a potential that outcome might not come to fruition either. So we encourage folks to look at projects on their own merits. And then we also do have a criteria that asks them to take into consideration previous investments and connectivity and building on investments that have made either by OWEB or other partners. So it's not necessarily cut and dry. Phased is there's a whole host of considerations that we ask for our reviewers to look at when it comes through that way.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Robin. Also appreciate the pretty big matches of leveraging OWEB funds. That's great. And I think of phasing as an indication that we're doing things well, right? People want to continue working with us. So right on. And Miriam, I think you're up next with land acquisition, and bring it on.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to endeavor to share my screen here. Is my PowerPoint visible?
Here it
Just
comes.
a second.
It's coming.
Yeah. All
There we
right.
go. Thanks.
Good. Again, my name is Miriam Forney. I'm OWEB's land acquisition coordinator. I'll walk you through a quick overview of the program and the grants we got, applications we received this cycle. The land acquisition program was authorized in the Constitution in 1998. It supports the purchase of property interests from willing sellers to maintain or restore watersheds and habitat for native fish and wildlife. OWEB-funded land acquisition projects address watershed resources and processes described in priorities adopted by the board in 2004, as well as priorities in local, regional, or state conservation plans for land acquisition. OWEB has spent approximately $60 million on land acquisition projects since the program's inception. 9 land acquisition applications requesting $12.2 million were submitted in the 2025 grant cycle. $4.25 million is anticipated for this cycle, with $6.5 million currently available for the full biennium, which is 2 grant cycles. 7 of the 9 applications propose the purchase of a fee simple interest in land, and 2 applications propose the purchase of a conservation easement interest in land, for a total of nearly 10,000 acres proposed for protection. Property sizes range from 1 acre to 3,300 acres, and grant requests range from $287,000 to $3.7 million. This slide features the properties that were proposed for OWEB funds in the 2025 land acquisition grant cycle. The application evaluation process is based on the criteria in the land acquisition administrative rules, and they include the significance of the projected ecological outcomes, including consideration of the project's consistency with established land acquisition priorities and plans. Also, the soundness of the legal and financial terms of the proposed real estate transaction, the capacity of the grant applicant or the intended property manager to complete the acquisition of the property interest and then achieve and sustain proposed ecological outcomes over time, and the community benefits or impacts resulting from the project. Land acquisition application reviews also include a public involvement process, and this process is distinct from the evaluation criteria, but it is a step noted in administrative rule. So public input is received and then described in the evaluation document for each application. So the evaluation process is wrapping up now, with evaluations expected to be delivered to applicants in mid to late March. And staff will develop funding conditions for projects recommended for funding. The conditions will be discussed with applicants and finalized by the April board meeting, when the board will make funding awards. That is all I've got. Renee, if there are questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Yeah, again, before we go to questions, enormous thanks to Miriam and to other members of the team, given that we have not seen this volume of land acquisition grant applications for over a decade. We convened a team process. So Miriam worked with Robin, also Audrey Squires from our Drinking Water Source Protection Program, and various other folks around the agencies, regional program reps. Others chipped in on public hearings. So it truly was a team effort, and we were building some of that plane as we were flying it. So just thanks to the team for their adaptability in that process, and Miriam always for your great leadership on actually implementing a very extensive evaluation process. So just wanted to note that on the record. Dan, turn it over to you.
All right, Jamie, it looked like you were up first.
Yeah, and first of all, Renee, thanks so much for that acknowledgement of staff. I mean, there's so much work that goes on before it even gets to these committee meetings, these public conversations, and on the board, we have the tremendous luxury of just being able to do a quick assessment, quick review, and ask questions. But I really appreciate that acknowledgement. The question I have is, yeah, you mentioned, Miriam, at the beginning, the 60 mil being spent to date. Is there any learning from those investments? How are we determining that sense of what's successful, and how does that inform our decision making going forward?
That's a big question. We've learned a lot about the investments that we've made over time. And land trusts and our other grant recipients have made big strides in developing, for example, strategic plans that help us to determine which applications make sense in a geographic context. We have learned about restoration outcomes on properties that are highly altered. That's something you're going to hear more about in today's meeting, most likely. And we've learned quite a bit from monitoring our conservation easements over time. All of that information it's sort of a programmatic level taken into account as we continue to run the program. I hope that's helpful. It's a really general answer.
Thank you. Russ, what do you got?
Yeah, I'm just also building in on what Jamie had said. It is an extraordinary shift to see the OWEB team working with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts in such an extraordinary way to get 9 high-quality projects submitted during this cycle. And I think it's a reflection of the awareness, the listening, the sensitivity towards the best practices we're trying to establish as a group. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a welcome shift to be able to see so many projects. And I did want to comment on something Miriam had emphasized here. Since the beginning, we have $60 million in OWEB investments. That does not factor in the extraordinary both private and public match that has been put into these projects. And that is really part of my question here, is how will we, in the review process, as we think about projects and their significance, do we look at match as a additive value, or do we actually have it? How do we deal with that as a part of the criteria? Because I think we are going to the legislature and to our public and telling them that we're getting great return for the investment being made. And I'm just curious how we are going to be looking at that moving into the future.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Russ. So our views on match have evolved somewhat over time. We don't consider excess match more favorably than we do 25% match. The reason for that is at least twofold. One is that folks have an idea of their match situation when they submit an application, but things change over the course of projects, and they may not have as much match by the time they close on their transaction as when they proposed it. And so it is a tricky evaluation criterion at best. The other thing to consider is that folks who have excess contributions to a project sometimes want to leverage that as match to another grant. And so in encouraging them to have over and above 25% for a land acquisition project may indeed limit how they can leverage those kinds of resources as matched to another grant application. There are other considerations as well. I would turn it over to Renee for any additional thoughts on match.
Yeah, Miriam, that was great. And I would say, Russ, that's consistent with how we handle match in other programs. If we have a required match amount, then we certainly need to ensure that that comes in the door from an eligibility standpoint, but are mindful of not disproportionately weighing more is better, especially given that sometimes at time of application, match is proposed rather than secured. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thanks, folks. Miriam, I'm just curious, like very quickly, what kind of involvement, do people show up for the public hearings, public meetings? I mean, how interested are folks in
Yeah,
these?
that's a good question. It varies from project to project. I think, for example, I believe that we had a couple hearings that were attended by just 1 or 2 or 3 people. We had another hearing that was attended by 30 plus people. Renee, you can correct me if I've got that number wrong. It really, I believe, is driven by 2 things. One is the level of interest by the community in a project. And the other is how well they understand the project. I think at times when folks have a pretty good handle on a project, their concerns are somewhat answered either in advance or in the application materials. Where folks have questions, they tend to show up to ask those. So it varies pretty widely.
Great. And you've got a lot of work to do to get ready for the April board meeting. And I'm just kind of wondering, other board members might be kind of curious, like if there is a lot of external curiosity about a project that we're funding, it might be worth kind of mention that to the full board. They might want to be interested in that. All right. Well, so far we're 20 minutes into a 15-minute agenda. So note to OWEB staff, our board members like to talk about these things. And so when we're planning agendas, we need to build more space for those conversations. We never have enough of that. And with that, Brian, you're up for the water acquisition program.
Thanks, Dan. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And there we go. Is my presentation up?
Not quite yet. Still not seeing anything. Maybe you gotta hit another button over there. Here it comes. Except we're seeing your calendar.
Oh. Let's see. Sorry for the delay, folks.
No worries, man. It's hard to keep up with technology. It's always a struggle to get the right button.
Okay, is it up now?
We got you now. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, again, everybody, Brian Walcott, coordinator for the Water Acquisition Grant Program. This is a grant program that was one of the foundational grant programs from when OWEB started with the Constitution in 1998. And I'll give a brief overview of the grant program and some applications that have been received this cycle and talk about the review process, but keeping in mind the time constraints. The Water Acquisition Grant Program has a purpose of increasing in-stream flow for habitat, species, and water quality benefits through the transfer of water rights to in-stream uses. And this is done through different types of transaction mechanisms, in-stream leases, in-stream transfers, other water use agreements, and the allocation of conserved water program. And that's a program managed by the Oregon Water Resources Department that allows a water right holder to do an efficiency project and allocate a portion of that savings in stream or all that saved water in stream, depending on the intent of the project. This grant cycle, we had 5 applications come in. I've only been managing the program for 3 years, but this is the most that we've seen come in. So just an increasing interest in the program. And these are coming in from around the state. We have one in Wheeler County in mid-Columbia region of Oregon, another in Deschutes Basin, and then 3 in the Rogue Basin. And these are a variety of projects that have a total request from the 5 applications of 3.7 million or a bit over that. The requests range from 92,000 up to 2.7 million. And that smaller project is a bundling of 3 5-year leases on the same tributary of the Rogue River. And then that larger project, the 2.7 million, is a project in the Deschutes Basin canal piping project with one of the irrigation districts in the upper Deschutes. There's 5 million currently available in the other funds allocated for this program. And so that's kind of an overview of the applications that have come in and the funding available. The process for OWEB, when these applications come in, there's an initial internal completeness check and eligibility check of the applications. If the applications make it through that process, then they're sent out to the review team members at state, tribal, and federal agencies. And we also have a private contractor team that also assists with application evaluations. Following individual reviews, we convene a technical review team meeting where the applications are discussed, including the strengths and concerns in relation to the 15 grant program criteria. The review team then determines a recommendation of fund, do not fund, or fund with conditions, and also ranks those applications. And from that, an evaluation is put together, and there's also an opportunity for public comments in both written or verbal comments, and all that is presented to the board, and this will occur in April, and it'll be an opportunity for the board to learn more about these applications and to deliberate and make a decision on whether to fund any of these applications that are recommended to you for funding. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions.
And briefly, Dan, I want to just note that in addition to running a grant cycle, Brian also is in the midst of helping to coordinate a rulemaking process for the Water Acquisition Division of Administrative Rules. So thanks, Brian, for keeping multiple really important balls in the air right now.
Yes, thanks, Brian. And Jamie, what do you have for us?
And Renee, the rulemaking process may address this, but I recall a year or so ago the board having a very robust conversation on unit costs. And so I'm just curious on how, and I appreciate your smile to that, Brian. I'm just curious how that's been addressed for this upcoming board conversation.
Well, that's always a consideration. It's one of the criteria is what is the cost of the project in relation to the economic benefit if the project is funded and implemented. And so it's always a discussion by the review team members, what percentage of a flow improvement would there be for the reach that's improved if the project's implemented, and what's the cost and over what period of time. Is this a 1-year lease, a 5-year lease, or a permanent transfer that's going to be in stream in perpetuity? So it's certainly a consideration. But as you can imagine, we've got a variety of projects, water use agreement, 5-year leases, and then also some irrigation efficiency projects on 3 of the applications. So there's certainly a very wide range in cost in relation to the amount of water.
Jamie, just briefly, relative to the rulemaking, we are more explicitly digging into for irrigation efficiency and irrigation modernization projects. What are some of the specific details expected from applicants around that and related to the evaluation criteria? But you won't see the rulemaking outcome until July. So there'll be some offset. Yeah.
Cool. Hey, just something to consider, Brian, as you come into the full board meeting in April. The full board had a conversation with that. Pardon my sort of inability to remember details, but there was like a legislative group working on water resources across the state. And I don't know, I know they were working on multiple things, and it might be good to hear if anything of that connects back to this program. And I'm also just sort of curious about whether maybe it already exists, whether there's like a priority of like those watersheds that are the most strained, and whether or not that comes into any of the decision making for these water acquisitions. And Kelly has a question as well.
Well, I do know, I think you're referring to the Water Caucus, the legislative, the bipartisan legislative group, and it was before I started working at OWEB in 2022. I believe the Water Caucus was involved in the drought package that included funding for programs at several agencies, including OWEB, and that was the original or an additional $10 million allocation to the Water Acquisitions Grant Program. So there has been that tie-in, but since then, I don't know if they've had any, I haven't noticed any specific interest or focus on the OWEB Water Acquisition Program in any of their deliberations.
Ryan, I can probably help with that briefly. I know the Water Caucus held a sort of informational briefing at the beginning of this short session and identified some broad kind of priorities and philosophical foundations, I'd say, but also just acknowledged that this session has been focused on balancing the budget, and we anticipate the next biennium to be quite tight as well. And so looking for new investment at this point is probably not going to be the priority of the caucus. Brian, did you want to comment briefly as well on, I guess, the second part of Dan's question, I think might have pointed to ODFW's prioritization?
Yeah, that Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has been working for a few years now on looking at habitat prioritization areas for stream flow restoration, and they're very near to having that completed. And it's looking at where, not only where is habitat needs the greatest for various species in around the state of Oregon, but they are also looking at where there's opportunities. If it's a reach where, or a river in the state where there isn't a lot of irrigation or withdrawals of water from the basin, and there isn't a great opportunity, then that might, I believe that's going to rank out lower than an area where there is quite a bit of irrigation occurring or other uses of water, where there could be an opportunity to do permanent or temporary transactions to improve flows for species. And that will be a map, not only a mapping process across the state by the major basins, but also sub-basins, tributaries. So that, yeah, it's very anticipated, and it's going to be very helpful for the water acquisition program.
Kelly, you have a question? Kelly? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know if you guys are having this too, but on my computer, if I swipe too far left and it goes into the corner and then it like pops up with Google News and stuff, and then I'm like, no, and I'm trying to get out of it and I can't get out of it. I don't know if anybody else has that problem, but it's really bothering me. And I'm like, how do I get this app off of my screen? So apologies. Yes. So just to follow up on that, there are so I guess question for Brian, because there are a number of things that, there's the Water Caucus, there's the place-based planning that's going on around the state, there's the integrated water resources strategy that's kind of going to be like the catch-all for everything for how we manage water into the future from OWRD. Brian, I assume that you guys are in the know about all of these things and taking all of these things into consideration, right?
Yes. Yeah. There's, we have criteria for the grant program that looks at state, federal, and tribal planning and priorities, and those are factored in when our review team is evaluating the merits of a project.
Awesome. Do you happen to know a date for when ODFW is going to put their prioritization out?
I don't. I know they're doing reviews with the local district biologist around the state, and they're just being really careful when they, that they've got everything complete and calibrated. And so it was my understanding this spring or this summer, but I know they've continued to run into delays.
This is a tough one to tackle, so I don't doubt it. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I had a question about the available funding and then how much, could you potentially just pull that slide back up for how much?
Yeah.
Sorry, no, we don't have to do that.
This is a test.
Yeah.
This is a
I know,
test.
sorry.
Yeah. But
Kelly,
yeah,
I think it's 5 million and I think we have 3.7 million in demand. Is that right, Brian?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my question is that 5 million supposed to get us through this water acquisitions cycle and another water acquisition cycle? Are we two?
I would say the board has not had that explicit conversation because prior to the $10 million allocation that Brian referenced from one of the drought resilience packages in the past, the land and water acquisition line item bundled the demand for both of those programs. So we have not said that $5 million, you all did not say that must take you through the biennium. That is what we currently have in this biennial spending plan. And recognizing that as soon as those dollars are gone, we will have land and water back in a joint line item in the spending plan.
Okay, thank you for that reminder, Renee. I appreciate that. That's helpful.
So it looks like we're up on the next agenda item.
Jamie
Sarah,
just
you wanna tell
popped
us
her
what-
hand up.
Yeah, sorry, Russ. Just based on Kelly's question as a follow-up, is there, given, I guess this is probably a question for you, Sarah, given that there is very limited funding and the concerns with funding, if we don't spend in this cycle for the full biennium, is there risk of clawback of these funds?
There is. We call it a sweep rather than a clawback. It sounds less violent somehow, but
Thank you for that correction.
There was a limited sweep associated with the last biennium's budget development, and I want to say that was 3 million, Renee, but it actually, there's some complexity around how that gets implemented that allows us to retain some interest, so that's kind of kept the level higher than it might have otherwise looked. We didn't see any evidence of an attempt to sweep this time. Short session's not over till short session's over, but it doesn't look like any of the budget bills currently under consideration sweep. So we'd have until the 27-29 budget development process, but it is, I mean, it's other fund that's sitting there and it can only be used for this purpose while it's in our hands, but if it got swept back, it could be used for other purposes. So there's no doubt about that. It probably doesn't make a ton of sense to intentionally sit on it, I guess I would say. I appreciate you raising it, Jamie. I think it's a really wise thing to be thinking about this cycle.
Yeah, thank you. Kelly prompted, and apologies, Chair, for jumping in a second question.
No problem. Okay, Sarah, Renee, you want to take us through where we are in the process?
Sure thing. Sarah, do you mind sharing the slides? Okay, so we are shifting gears back to the land acquisition modernization process. Sarah, I think we can go to the next slide. Whoop. She'll get there. All right, I think, yeah.
Sorry, I was sharing an old version.
Okay, I'll just.
So I'm gonna fix that.
And I can start in the interest of time.
I think the file literally says do not use on it. So let me get the right one up. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yep. So in the interest of time, just quick reminder for the committee about the 4 foundational questions that we had teed up early on for you. Soon you'll see a slide with these bulleted out. So the first foundational question was focused on our use of conservation easements to meet that title restriction requirement that is in statute. So we've covered some of that ground. The second foundational question, which we are finally digging into in earnest today, is focused on significant habitat interpretation around that and then expectations of future conditions. We have a third foundational question, which Jessica she kind of pointed to in her, Jessica McDonald, in her public comment around other uses. So that could encompass things like recreational uses, cultural uses, working lands. And then the fourth foundational question is really focused on agencies' risk tolerance. We heard a bit about that during public comment too. And I would note that the risk tolerance topic, I think, has already been woven into multiple of our discussions already. So Sarah, any
I'm
luck?
sorry. There must be some kind of global jinx on this kind of thing today. That is, yeah.
Okay.
About that.
Yep. And then can you go to the next slide? Okay, perfect. So what we've discussed thus far, just brief orientation. So risk considerations. I think we've had some good conversations around how can we be more specific and deliberate about defining risk and describing different types of risk. So if you think back to some of what Bruce Buckmaster shared before he left the committee around likelihood of risk, severity of the outcomes of that, what are the impacts of it? So also thinking through among different types of risks, what are the trade-offs we might face? And around risk management, if we're trying to be a very accountable public funder and really minimizing risks, the trade-offs that might come with if we have an undersubscribed program because of perceived barriers with the program. So some work already on that, and then important to determine which of those types of risks are most of concern to the board. I don't think we have an equal distribution, is my sense from the committee conversations thus far, about all risk is equally concerning. So really digging into some of that. We've talked about conservation easements, as I noted, including going to the third bullet, the really robust discussion we had with various federally recognized tribes during the tribal panel in December, and hearing from them about topics related to conservation easements and the use of those, but also issues around cultural uses, active management, and ways that we might contemplate having a more trust-based relationship with our federally recognized tribal partners. On conservation easements, I do think there's been a bit of question around, is it the instrument itself, or is it how the conservation easement tool has been implemented in the program? So those are some of the things we've already covered, and we try it at least once every meeting to present the pyramid diagram that Diane first shared with you, I think almost 2 years ago, just to help you orient where we are on that scale of elevations. So I think, Sarah, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so digging in on our focus for today, the foundational habitat question, we've presented it here. Should OWEB's land acquisition program incorporate an expectation of active restoration of properties acquired? Or is a land transaction that solely protects land sufficient to meet OWEB's interpretation of constitutional and statutory requirements, even if existing habitat values are more modest or marginal? So again, we heard public comment, verbal public comment, received some written public comment on this topic previously. So just wanted to note that. So Sarah, we can go to the next slide. So in terms of significant habitat, in your meeting materials for today, we did develop a habitat memo for use back in the December meeting, didn't quite get there. Want to first credit both Robin and Miriam for a lot of work on that memo with Sarah and me as we prepped for this foundational question discussion. So in the memo, we start by outlining habitat related language that's included in the Constitution and statute, and then through the memo connecting that down to how the land acquisition programs expectations have really been set over a few years or a few decades rather, and how that's interwoven in various elevations of the program. So here we present the constitutional language for the land acquisition grant program. So you see that secure long-term protection for lands that provide significant habitats for native fish and wildlife habitat. And generally, and this is fairly generally, there's nuance with each project, the program expectation has been that either projects come in with relatively high existing habitat value, or there's a path to restorability to a future condition that creates high habitat value. So I think, Sarah, with that, you're going to take the next few slides.
I am, and there are so many things open that I had to think even to unmute myself here. So, we've had a lot of this conversation in the abstract, and so we just wanted to share a couple of examples that are in fact not OWEB funded projects, to be thinking about the reality of sort of how this kind of question plays out in not only our original decision process about our recommendation about whether to fund a project, um, but also sort of throughout the project development cycle. And so I just wanted to note, so there are two projects here. One Washington project that shows an example of an estuary restoration project prior to the return of tidal influence. So it's kind of a mode field, right? And so I think sometimes when we think about this question, it might be tempting to imagine habitat that's sort of moderate function and that we're requiring restoration on top of that. And you know, I think that scenario deserves some discussion for sure. But you can also imagine this kind of situation where the ecosystem has actually been really highly impacted. And I think one of our public commenters made reference to the importance of kind of taking a different approach for different kinds of projects, which Renee will dive into in quite a bit more detail later. But you can imagine, you know, prior to the restoration of tidal influence in a project like this, there might actually be pretty limited ecological significance. The other one example here I included is a little bit different, and I wanted to just kind of have a couple of mental images in mind as we talk through how the program currently works and what different recommended changes might do. This is a Metro Parks and Nature property recently purchased by Metro. It's near my house. I can see the edge of it out my window right now, which might be part of why I chose it as an example. A ton of potential for oak habitat. It's been functioning as a golf course for many decades. So actually, if I went out and took a picture of it right now, all of that turf has been, herbicided, and it looks actually quite catastrophic, even though it's already on a great path to restoration. So there's different elements of habitat function going on here at the same time. There are nice big oak trees with a lot of, potential wildlife benefit. And it's literally operated as a golf course. And so what's under it looks and acts a lot like more like a golf course. And so I just wanted to encourage folks to have a lot of different sort of mental images in mind where we might have something that already has significant function and there might be options to restore. There might be areas where, boy, this feels like it wouldn't meet our constitutional mandate if we don't restore some significant amount of function. And Renee will talk more about sort of timelines and mechanisms in a moment. And there's just a huge gray area in between, right? So you can imagine kind of a continuum of different projects. So I do want to remind folks too, as we kick off here, this is not limited to like a yes/no funding decision in terms of, hey, is this significant enough for us to pay for it or not? It really becomes complex in the application ranking process where, for example, with the 9 projects that Miriam shared that the review team was going through this cycle, there's this complex calculus of like, what do we do with these projects that have a ton of existing habitat value versus ones that have a ton of potential, but we have to do kind of a detailed analysis of what are the potential barriers to that future significant habitat function being restored. And we recognize that it's a dynamic and ever-changing space for our grantees to work through. We're here for the conversation and for the kinds of changes folks have been discussing and that the board, is evaluating. But I just wanted to kind of share that glimpse at the complexity of like how do you compare those apples and oranges in that application review cycle, and then what are the implications for, okay, we funded it based on restoration potential. What's our level of responsibility for, to help or to require for that actual restoration to come through? So I do encourage folks to think about that diversity and also not just the sort of fund it, don't fund it, but the complexity that that brings throughout review and ranking, due diligence, closing of transactions, kind of all the way through the process there. Renee made a reference earlier to the risk matrix that we developed. I think this was both in response to Bruce and maybe Jamie. I think a couple of folks in our early meetings said, boy, it would really be helpful to have a clearer idea of what kinds of risk we're talking about. And so just as we work our way through this, a lot of what we're talking about falls into this environmental and ecological category at the bottom. I feel like the next slide actually says what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. On the one hand, what's our level of confidence that we're investing in habitat that is either inherently currently significant or will in the future be significant versus, our grantees, applicants seeing barriers to completing projects from a purchase and easement or a transaction perspective that, that the sense is that those bars have become high enough or the process has become burdensome enough that it's dissuading us from setting applications in the process, or, that it's actually making it more difficult, in which case you get to this under subscription box down here that we've talked a fair amount about. And I think our public commenters and panels often point to as, hey, if you've got under subscription, then you've got kind of a different kind of risk going on, that the program's just not meeting its mandatory, constitutional requirements because we're undersubscribed and under investing. Yep. So that's the tension. That's the tension that was going to be on the next slide. I do want to remind folks, in the past, I think public commenters talked a lot about, sort of risk minimization or a risk avoidance perspective, that I think there's a perception that's increased over time, and I think that's worth digging into. And I think there's sometimes even a perception that that's been staff driven. And I just want to remind folks, we have done a lot of work to minimize risk in this program. And it's, perfectly acceptable to step back and figure out how to rebalance that at this point. But that has been based in part on board concerns on the outcomes of past projects, on the process of bringing us through. We have a board decision in front of us, and there's maybe more of an emphasis on in board deliberations on, mitigating or avoiding risk. And so I just want to mention that that's, one of the reasons that this committee's work is so important, is that when we try to get a sense of the board's risk tolerance on a project by project, funding decision by funding decision basis, it can be kind of all over the map, just because projects are really different, bring really different perspectives, and individual board members bring different perspectives. And so a lot of what we're going to try to get out of you guys in the deliberations over the next few days here is just a sense of, the current tolerance for risk and the current sense of the board and how we balance accessibility and risk in this program. And so that's a place where we're really, as with other foundational questions, looking for some clear direction on the board, that if we have that temperature check, if we have that sense, then we can go back and bring some more specific recommendations of, here are some changes that we could make to this program. And so a lot of our questions will be sort of, how do we think about this in future program modifications and future cycles. I do also want to mention that in our conversations about why a sort of anticipated restoration might fail, we've focused a lot on funding. So how can we be expecting grantees to meet certain restoration criteria when we're not paying for it, and we know that their restoration actions are likely really limited by their ability to access funding to do that restoration. And again, totally valid question. And I just wanted to share some additional perspectives that we've talked a lot about funding availability. We have not talked a lot about shifting priorities. And we do know that some applicants, and I would say especially governments that don't have the kind of, primary conservation purpose that our land trust colleagues in public comment mentioned, just face a lot of competing priorities. So the project closes, the focus may shift significantly away from habitat restoration, especially in a limited funding environment. So I do want to remind folks, that land trusts have a conservation purpose, a 501c3 status, and often accreditation. They are not the only folks who participate in this program. So, keeping in mind as we explore this dynamic that, our friends in local government, for example, face a lot of competing priorities, and, that may make it difficult to actually achieve restoration goals in a very different sense than just strictly funding availability. Another thing we've seen a lot in the past is that barriers to implementation arise that we're maybe unaware of during the project application process, and the grantee themselves might have been unaware of. And so we've developed due diligence systems that help to identify those barriers to implementation of restoration actions really early on, especially when we're saying, hey, we're funding this based on an assumption about future condition. Otherwise, it wouldn't be as competitive. So does the grantee have access to actually do restoration activities on the property? Do they have, neighbors that might be concerned about specific restoration actions that they're proposing? Are there, potential impacts to roads or other infrastructure in the area that, boy, we thought this was a good idea, and then when we get in and start implementing it, it turns out to be a lot harder than we thought. And that's no shade at all on our grantees, right? This is really complex, hard stuff. And so the tone that we would be, the culture that we would be aiming for as we navigate through those challenges is, as one of our grantees said in a private conversation, hey, we want to feel shoulder to shoulder with you as a grantor. As we work our way through these challenges, stuff changes. There is no certainty. There's a long term of evolution where some restoration moves forward. So I think the question in my mind is, in the face of all those kind of very real challenges to kind of working with future habitat potential, how do we balance those, and how do we help grantees feel like we are shoulder to shoulder in meeting those challenges, and not just sort of setting expectations and asking folks to figure out how to meet them. So that's a little philosophical. We're going to ask Renee now to dive into more detail, and I just want to give the co-chairs a chance to interrupt and tell if it's time for a bio break, or should we dive a little bit further into the details of the habitat memo before we keep going here?
So it looks like we're roughly about 15, 20 minutes behind. This is going to be a really important conversation for us. I guess out of respect for time here, why don't we take a 5-minute break before we have Miriam get into the details and get back and try to be disciplined as we think about our comments as we move through this very rich topic as a group. So how about we take 5 minutes and start up quickly when we return?
10:22. That would be 10:22 by my
Thank you.
clock. And it is Renee coming back, not Miriam, just so that Miriam doesn't think something surprising is happening at 10:22. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. A little more than that. We're going to go to new. Like we have everyone?
Well, you have me and Renee and Miriam.
That's all we need. Let's roll.
Okay, let's get going.
We could start. If folks miss a minute or two, then at least it's recorded.
Yeah.
Can you share screen again, Sarah, please?
Well, probably. How's that?
All right, perfect. Yep. Okay, so we'll shift gears back to the habitat memo. I'll try to move through this at a fairly quick clip, but want to just do some grounding. So focusing here on the habitat related information that sits at kind of various levels of elevation. So we talked a bit about the constitutional and statutory language. There is more information in the habitat memo that fleshes some of that out. There is some habitat related information in administrative rule. Also, I would focus most of that in the evaluation criteria section of the rule. So for example, the evaluation criteria focus on things like a project's alignment with conservation priorities that Miriam mentioned, significance of projected ecological outcomes, and then also the capacity of the applicant or the holder of the property to achieve and sustain proposed ecological outcomes over time, among other things. We also, in public comment, and I think in Miriam's presentation, she potentially touched on it too, or at least in Q&A, reference those 2004 ecological principles and priorities that were adopted by the board. So that gets at both some conservation biology principles, 7 principles that really we're aiming for with land acquisition projects, but then also some basin level priorities. So that is—
And Renee, that's the same thing that Natasha was referencing.
Exactly. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So those are kind of the focused portions of the administrative rules that touch on habitat. There are some other pieces in rule that are referenced more generally. So things like a grant agreement, funding conditions, and those can have habitat components in it, but they are not articulated out in quite the same way in administrative rules. So a lot of the other habitat related content sits in program materials, program guidance, templates, etc. So that's the second hollow bullet that you see here on the slide. So for example, the grant agreement outlines funding conditions, it references conservation values, includes other terms and conditions, the conservation easement, which we have a template document for, covers topics such as conservation values, again, future conditions, if those are applicable, if we have a restoration requirement for a funded project, talks about baseline inventories, prohibited uses, detailed management plan. So again, that sits, while pieces of that are referenced in administrative rules, a lot of that detail sits in program guidance. So I think, Sarah, we can go to the next slide. So I want to drill into these a bit just to give you a sense of, so we're on the same page of what these things mean. So when I mentioned funding conditions, so we have both standard conditions for all acquisition projects that we fund, but then we also have project specific conditions, and at times those are initial and secondary conditions. So those can touch on things such as timing for work to be done during due diligence, communication processes, if appropriate, expectations around management of other uses, whether that be recreation or working lands, stewardship, restoration planning. So those certainly have a habitat nexus in terms of some of what sits in program materials. Conservation values, it's something that's it's defined here on the slide, and that's referenced in both the grant agreement and the conservation easement template. So ecological features, whether currently existing or likely to exist in the future. And that's kind of the basis of what's expected from a project. Baseline inventory. So generally all conservation easements, it's not just related to OWEB specifically, but they reference a baseline document that really does provide that baseline record of a property's condition. So baselines can be quite important as you're understanding kind of trajectory through time, and then also if needed during enforcement. And then description of restored condition. So this is used when OWEB does have a restoration requirement or connecting specific restoration actions as a requirement for funding a particular property that might be more degraded. And so the description of restored conditions outlines the anticipated future conditions that are expected to result from restoration actions, and then that does connect back in those instances to the conservation easement document. So for the next few slides, I would encourage Miriam, and to the degree it's relevant, Robin, because you worked on the habitat memo too, please chime in if there's anything that I've missed or misstated. So for this and the next several slides. So I think
Renee, can I actually just emphasize something that you did state, which is that final bullet. I think what you said, and my understanding is that is only applied to significantly degraded properties that are acquired where we really, have a concern about significance. And so that's, as I understand it, a pretty small subset of projects that have been funded throughout the life of the program.
It is, and in a few slides we'll get to something that I think may be some terminology issues that are bumping up against each other, and so that will be really important. But yes, thank you for flagging that. Description of restored conditions is used when restoration requirements exist, and then we have something else called desired future conditions that I'll get to in a minute. Yep, next slide. Okay, so also touched on prohibited uses. Those are defined in the easement. Page 6 of the habitat memo outlines some examples. So for example, no commercial or industrial activities, off-road vehicle use, etc. So certain uses can be prohibited unless they're specifically either authorized in the management plan or approved by OWEB. And we do periodically receive requests from grantees to update that based on project specific situations they're seeing on the ground. And then management plan. So this again sits in kind of program materials. It's a comprehensive document. We provide a management plan guidance document that basically describes here are the kind of minimum requirements or expectations as grantees are developing management plans. And the management plan itself is very comprehensive, includes things like conservation values, restored future conditions, timelines, uses of properties, among other topics. There is an OWEB review and approval process, both for the initial management plan that's developed for a project that we fund. And then also there is a process by which grantees can come and request or suggest updates to the management plan. That also includes an iterative review and approval process with OWEB. So I think I'll pause there. Miriam or Robin, anything to add on these two slides? Okay, hearing none, I'll keep us moving. So thank you, Sarah, for the prompt earlier. So as we've been hearing information from case studies, hearing the feedback during the tribal panel, public comments during ARE meetings, we realized that there may be some kind of direct questions that we should try to provide some answers on in terms of how historically we've implemented some of these steps or tools that sit in that kind of program guidance space. So again, Miriam, please chime in here. I've put these questions together with a lot of background input from Miriam, given her long history with the program. But feel free, Miriam and Robin, to chime in here. So in terms of description of restored conditions, that is not a requirement for all grants. It's historically used on those situations where we've invested in highly altered properties and are kind of looking forward to what do we hope will occur with that property. In cases where description of restored conditions is utilized, it's documented in the conservation easement itself. Desired future conditions, very similar term. That is not something that is contained anywhere but the management plan document, and it is required content in all management plans. So historically, as I mentioned earlier, we've had a review and approval process both for the initial management plans and also any updates. So co-chairs, are you okay with Mark asking his question now? Go ahead, Mark.
Yes, go Mark. And welcome, Mark. Why don't you introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Mark Webb, EQC liaison to the OWEB board. So as I'm hearing you, Renee, in this conversation, there's an important distinction between desired future conditions for degraded properties as opposed to those that aren't as degraded or degraded at all. And so on this second bullet point, desired future conditions could be current existing conditions carried out into the future or maintained. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. We've heard questions about or feedback about management plan flexibility. So in terms of historical implementation approach, we have allowed for grantees at times to develop an interim management plan if they are, I think, Russ, in past meetings, you've described that sometimes it takes a while to get to know these properties. And so it may be most appropriate to have an interim management plan for multiple years and then ultimately adopt a final management plan. And then, as I mentioned, we've got the review and approval process, and management plans can be revised and updated. So I think, Sarah, let's go to the next slide. And this is the last one on historical implementation approach. So we've heard concerns about a specific timeline requirement. I think this is one where I don't know if it's terminology, if it's implementation approach, but there is not a specific timeline required for most of the restoration. And when folks develop a management plan, there's a 20-year time horizon overall on that, and those are chunked then into 5-year increments. And so I do think that maybe the first 5-year chunk, there may be either a real or perceived push or expectation around if required restoration needs to occur within a specific time period. Heard some questions about is active management allowed? Historically, if it's demonstrated to be either beneficial for or kind of consistent with the expectations for the property around native fish and wildlife habitat, then active management certainly can be considered, and it's historically documented in the management plan. Allowable uses historically depends on the conservation easement and the management plan content. It has been limited as necessary to prioritize fish and wildlife habitat. And I would say that's both kind of overarching habitat impacts, and then at times staff have reviewed that in terms of what are the impacts to particular species and individual kind of animal or population responses or reactions to some of those other allowable uses. So Miriam, given that you were source of a lot of this information, please feel free to chime in. Maybe first we'll hear Mark's question, but feel free to add any clarifications as needed here.
Yeah, so real quickly, it sounds like active management, if you want to undertake that, has to be demonstrated to be beneficial. Is there any reason there's kind of a bias that way, as opposed to thinking that really we should justify passive management if we're not going to do something? I'm just wondering why, because at least East Side, virtually every property I'm aware of in Eastern Oregon needs something done, and they need it done consistently. So,
Miriam, any thoughts on that?
If I understand your question correctly, Mark, there are some instances in which all that's really necessary is passive management, and by passive, perhaps controlling weeds and trespass. There isn't a lot of restoration that's needed, and in that case, that is just laid out in the management plan and is certainly allowable from a OWEB standpoint.
no, I get that, Miriam. Maybe I wasn't clear. Why do we have to justify active management? I haven't heard us justifying passive management. Why wouldn't we have to do one or the other depending on the quality of the property and the kind of disturbance patterns that characterize that kind of a landscape?
Yeah, so either one of them is, by dint of developing a management plan with the kind of content we're looking for, either approach is justified inherently in the content of the management plan. But I suspect not. Is that helpful?
Yeah, just it is. Yeah, I don't need to say anymore. Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, I think part of what you're seeing here is just influenced by the question we're responding to, right? Which is what we've heard concerns from partners that we don't allow for active management. And so that was kind of the question we were answering, is we think that we do when it doesn't, significantly negatively impact the habitat values that the transaction is supposed to be supporting. And if that's not the experience grantees are having in the management planning process, then that deserves some attention. Like, I'm not saying that, that they're so confused they can't tell what we're asking them to do in the management planning process. So, but I think the way that this answer is framed that you're asking about is in part because we were responding to a partner concern that, hey, you guys, you're so limited in your approach to active management. And I think it might be helpful to sort of dive in, as we have after previous meetings, to a couple of case studies to say, like, okay, what's an example where it felt like we had an inappropriately low tolerance for active management? Because I do think when we've worked through those case studies in the past, we think we're providing this kind of flexibility. That's not how the grantee is experiencing it. Then getting down to those nuts and bolts is super important of what's creating that perception. But I do also think that, I'm remembering Jessica McDonald's comments in opening too, of sort of the philosophical roots of land protection. And I don't think any of us on this team and probably on this call would say, oh yeah, we want to take the fortress approach here. But the history of this program goes back 25 years, and we're still working with some systems that have been developed fairly early in that and then evolved along the way. So I think it would be a fair space and a space where we'd really appreciate the board's active guidance to say, this is how you should think about this, is that, you know, on a case-by-case basis, evaluating different management approaches and different levels of active versus passive is totally appropriate. Let's not default to either one of those. That's the kind of philosophical guidance that would be really helpful to bring into this process, just because we're not day to day, I don't think, running on 1995 science or assumptions, but some of that may be woven in ways that are not particularly visible to us now. So
Well, that's
the
helpful. My
refresh.
sense has been that you're not quite back, or OWEB's not quite back in 1995. But just the management plan examples and all the list of prohibited activities suggests that conservation is really about hands-off approach. And it's nice that y'all are clarifying that that's not the case. So I just wanted to get clear that passive isn't the sort of default, that we're going to be sensitive to what the landscape needs and how to maintain that going forward. And I think that really helps in a lot of ways for other questions we want to address. So
Yeah.
thanks.
And I would really, just before we change topics, really encourage us to put that specifically in the board's sort of recommendation, or the committee's recommendations up to the board and guidance to staff. Like, don't assume that we've got the message because we talked about it, positively here today. Mark, I really think that's a good area of direction or guidance to work into that document.
Miriam, I think you were up, and then Russ, and then me.
To respond to something that Mark just raised, there are a couple activities that are listed in our conservation easement as outright prohibited, and those are such as activities that are illegal, dumping hazardous waste, mining. Beyond those, I'd call them showstoppers. Just about any management tool is available to grantees on properties that we help to fund, and those management tools are selected and reviewed through the management planning process. So there is a lot of flexibility. There's also a couple things that are completely apart from the management plan. So for example, in our easement, folks can go ahead and do noxious weed control and remove danger trees, other kinds of vegetation manipulation, without even having them included in the management plan. We want those tools to be available to our partners, perhaps while they're developing a management plan. The other thing I'd say just quickly is I think staff have been guilty of running together maybe two terms that have a really important distinction, and Renee touched on this. One of them is the description of restored conditions. The other is desired future conditions. The quick history is that we had an advisory committee working to develop our easement in 2013, and we had some consultants working to develop our management planning, and they landed on similar sounding terms that actually have really different meanings. We have used the description of restored conditions in 13 of our 120 property investments. Those are for highly altered properties. So for example, former tidal wetlands that have been diked and converted to grazing ground, or floodplain forest that's been cleared and turned into grass seed field, for example. That's where we have required restoration. Without restoration, Natasha in her public comment used the "but for" phrase. But for the promise of restoration, those properties wouldn't compete really well for our funds. So again, 13 out of 120 properties where we have required restoration to achieve certain outcomes. Desired future conditions is a term used in the management planning guidance. Unfortunately, very similar sounding to the other term. That is simply a loose term used to describe what a property is going to look like at the end of a management planning period. And that can be, as was suggested earlier, conditions that look a lot like the starting conditions, so they're being maintained. So I think that distinction has driven some confusion, and the need for clearer terminologies is obvious.
That helps me. Thank you for the context. Yeah.
Go ahead, Russ.
So from my perspective, just the sheer acquisition of fee and/or easement is a significant step in of itself, in that the applicant is now committing to having this property exposed to the ecosystem functions such as fire, drought, flood, and the habitat and any habitat reset that is associated with those exposures over time. So we are getting significant benefit just by the virtue of the acquisition of the habitat. And I just, again, in the face of climate change, being humble that we will have multiple resets over time, and there's nothing wrong with that. That is the nature of ecosystem function. So again, just being humble as we go into this process with an understanding of desired future conditions means, to me, exposure to those basic functions that that are out there in the environment.
Thanks, Russ. Go ahead, Renee.
Thanks, Dan. So just two things. One, I want to be very sensitive to, we have gotten a lot of input about some of these topics, and the grantee perspective, applicant and grantee perspective on how this is working. We've described our perspective on how this has kind of historically been implemented. At times, these two things are they're not doing this, they're doing this. And we need to figure out the method to get through some of that, because I don't think this is not intended, those last 4 or so slides were not intended to be a point counterpoint. This is historically the agency's thinking on approach, and we are hearing some feedback that's quite different from that. So I think Sarah touched on that, but I just think that's an important pin to put in this discussion, is space to work through that. I think, Russ, to your point, and Dan, I'm not trying to rush you, the next slide does actually lay out the habitat related questions when it's time to go there. There were some things captured in the habitat memo that we wanted, including, is acquisition alone enough? But I also think that the nature of this conversation over the last multiple committee meetings, you may have lots of other input or more habitat related questions for us than the 4 that we teed up for you, but just a sneak preview for what's coming next.
Got you. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Let me just run off a couple questions and then, follow up as I think appropriate. One is following up on what Russ mentioned about those resets. Do we have sufficient leverage? Because once we make the investment, it seems like that's then done. Do we still have leverage going forward? It was also for Sarah mentioned the shifting government priorities. How do we address those components? Another question is regarding the prohibited or allowable uses. I think the reference is something about not harvesting, but I'm wondering, when I'm thinking about that triangle of legislation, how we make sure we're honoring treaty obligations within that, if there's some things taken off the table for standard uses going forward, but then have been part of our treaty commitments. And then the third piece is, and I know this is the essence of our conversation, but just if we reduce the requirements, and I hear the reference to what is sometimes called unfunded mandates from our partners, how do we still, given that we're investing public funds, how do we maintain our commitment to those public funds and honor that they are provided and given for a specific purpose? And if we're pulling back on how we maintain that purpose, do we still have some leverage in how we still accomplish it, such that someone can't come back later 10 years from now and say, yeah, you spent public funds on this and it's heading in a totally different direction?
I'm going to touch briefly on that, and then Renee and Miriam and others feel free. But I think, Jamie, that your points 1 and 3, I think, are exactly like the story of how we landed where we're at. And I really appreciated Renee's comment that this is not meant as a point counterpoint, or this is the only way to do it. Like, that's all up for, discussion, amendment, board direction, whatever. But it was exactly those sort of bookends of like, how do we make a decision to fund a project that has, stellar potential future condition, and how do we balance that against one that has stellar current condition? And then what responsibility do we have to the public or to the legislature or to the, the folks playing the lottery? I don't know how to describe our constituencies, but if at the end of the day, a project that does come in as one of those super highly impacted habitats is still sitting there like a hay meadow that's not connected to tidal influence, and that's kind of what we thought we were paying for. And so I think part of the point that partners have made, which I think is super valid and worth attending to, is the vast majority of what we fund is not at that really extreme end of the spectrum where I'm going to find myself in front of a legislative committee down, 20 years down the road saying, how the heck did you think this was significant habitat? And now it's just a source of weeds and mosquitoes or whatever. But that's, you really hit, I think, on the dilemmas that got us here to this point. And I think part of what we're hearing from partners is like, well, to what extent do you have to engineer this system to avoid that kind of risk? I mean, county commissioners and legislators are mad at me for a variety of reasons on a regular basis. Is this, how far should we go into building that into the program designed to avoid that sort of political and ecological risk, when we know that the vast majority of grantees have a conservation mission, have the accreditation, have, the pieces in place to do their very best to move that forward. So I think what I remember a very early meeting, Jamie, where you said, like, let's talk about what the worst thing is that can happen, and it probably won't actually be that bad. And I think for a lot of the projects that we fund, that's true. And sometimes if we've iteratively built these systems based on, past concerns, it adds up to a threshold that's like, okay, in sum total, it's very risk averse, maybe like on a particular issue. But we kind of got there step by step when we saw something go wrong and we tried to fix it. We saw something go wrong and we tried to fix it with individual projects, which is exactly why this moment to kind of clear the decks and say, like, what's an appropriate level of structure to avoid that outcome, and what can we tolerate in terms of risk? It's exactly the question. Your treaty rights question, just in the interest of keeping going, I'm going to ask that we kind of hold that. Jamie, I don't know. I know you had not formally joined the board when we had our tribal panel a couple of meetings ago. So I meant to suggest before this meeting that you consider going back and watching that if you haven't already, but it is a topic that came up a little bit there, and that, we've been discussing in much more detail with our friends at DOJ. So I think we're probably not to a point where we can comment on that, but I do want to acknowledge that it's a topic we've been working on and seeking advice from DOJ of just sort of how do we structure land acquisitions in a way that's respectful of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights kind of within the statutory constraints that we face. So can we bookmark that one? Thanks.
Then we got Dan, our co-chair.
Yep. First of all, thank you, Miriam, and all of OWEB for being such great stewards of this public money. I mean, I appreciate all of the work that's been done to, to meet the goals. And I think we're here for very good reasons, personally. I mean, I'm a public servant. I think you guys have been doing exceptionally well as public servants personally. And I especially appreciate the context of, the scale of this problem. 13 out of 120 projects. I mean, it's really beneficial to hear kind of some of that context. And as a co-chair, I'll just say I like the discussion piece, right? And so I think it's fine to interrupt the flow and have the discussion. My biggest pet peeve here is that we don't build enough time into our agendas for the discussion. So now I'm going to kind of get to my points I wanted to make. So the management plan piece, right? And to Mark's point, like active restoration, active management, passive management, we're just talking about management, right? And if I'm hearing things correctly, it sounds like one of the complaints is like, we're trying to act fast to purchase this parcel of land that, that we think is really important to purchase. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trying to purchase it. And the burden of coming up with a fully comprehensive management plan is sort of, kind of maybe a deal killer time-wise, or there's just not enough information. We haven't had boots on the ground to figure it out. And so in other kind of long-term management strategies that I'm aware of, there's never this idea that we're going to have a management plan that answers all the questions. It just doesn't exist. What exists is an adaptive management plan, right? It's like, hey, this is kind of what we think is going to work. And, we'll implement some of that. And as we implement it, we'll learn and we'll adapt and we'll do different things. And so I'm just wondering if as we work down, and by the way, I'm not looking for answers. I'm just kind of rambling. As we work towards a recommendation to the broader board, like, I'm curious what folks think about how we could structure these management plans differently. I've already heard like there's kind of this concept already of 5-year things, right? And so maybe the first 5 years is just like, this is why we think there's a lot of potential in this hayfield next to the ocean. It looks like crap to me, but maybe it's an important wildlife corridor, and in and of itself, having wildlife go through there versus trying to cross it. I mean, I don't know, but it just seems like we could maybe have some sort of a phased management process that helps people deliver sort of a minimal amount that helps the review team get a big enough picture to say yay or nay, and then know that this is kind of an adaptive process. And then part of that, right, is kind of related to the risk piece, because I don't think we're mitigating risk. I think we're passing risk on to our partners, right? I mean, there's inherent risk in these ecological, desired future, whatever you want to call them. At the end of the day, even as Russ said, even if it's a perfect thing right now, there's risk that, it's going to burn down or something's going to happen. So it just seems to me like we have mitigated the risk to us as public stewards of public money, right? The way we've mitigated that is by passing it on to the recipients of these funds, right? We say, hey, we're held accountable for making sure this money is spent for significant habitat. And so the way we're going to do that is put a big burden on you for delivering that significant habitat. And I think that's where this conversation about being better partners and standing shoulder to shoulders really is going to kind of come into play, right? It's like there's no way to kind of make risk go away. And so it's like, how do we sort of use this management plan to help us in our decision-making process, to understand what the desired future condition is, capture that, but we're not necessarily going to try to hold a partner accountable for delivering that at the end of the day, because there's no way they can. But how do we make sure that we're continuing to go down that path through some sort of a phased adaptive management? And now I'm going to shut up and hand it over. And Renee, I'm not really looking for an answer. That's just sort of a thought.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for flagging that, because I think that what you prompted for the committee to have wheels turning on is just what is that kind of gradation of expectation? So there are some things, if we think about being an accountable public funder, there are, like, for example, I'm looking at Diane on my screen, like there are some base legal sufficiency requirements that if we engage in a contract or a grant with an entity, we have to meet those. I think, though, there's then a gradation of, what are the expectations? Where do we need to flag and minimize risk as an agency? Where can we say, where can you recommend to the board, these are the things of greatest concern to us around risk? Some of these other things maybe have a different shade of concern for us. And so that certainly could change some aspects of how the program is structured. I think we can't lose some of those base requirements, but I think some of it is just having input from the board on what do you all care about most? Are you okay with something like you don't get to restoration for 20 years in cases where it's required because you need that long to get to know the property and to figure out funding? Just having, I think, more of a dialogue once you're in the project, but even early on, some kind of gradation or spectrum of those things that we have to have figured out over different time horizons to attempt to manage the risk that you as a board determine you care about, given the granting authority. So just having that open conversation, I think, will be really helpful for staff as we're thinking through refinements and how to implement those.
And Renee, just to sort of respond to that is, and part of that is how do we move, instead of trying to address all those risks in some sort of, magic management plan that's going to get us exactly where we want in 20 years, right? How do we sort of use this model of moving the risk piece into sort of the decision making for each property, right? And so we have great land stewards out there. We can trust them to do the right thing. And when we get, 9 applications, some of them are going to inherently carry more risk than others, right? And so, that maybe should be part of the decision-making process. If folks are super uncomfortable with inherently more risky projects, then, again, we don't necessarily need it baked into a management plan, but we need, a really good explanation about those risks. And so that the people who know about this stuff, who is not me, but the people who know about this stuff can say, yeah, these are high risks, and they have a pretty good path forward here, and based on the expert review panel, they're feeling pretty good about it. And if they can't deliver that much, then they don't get funded. That's all. Go ahead, Russ.
So, Dan, good comments. Following on your perspective that you just had developed, I look at the new state wildlife action plan, and embedded consistently throughout that entire plan is the elevation of the importance in the face of climate change of connectivity. And I think about the sheer process of doing a land acquisition or a fee acquisition and or an easement, what that is doing for us in terms of taking certain threats off the table as we make a public investment in ensuring forever that we will not have mining development, but we allow for that property to be placed into conservation and have the, if nothing else, the connectivity potential of that property, whether it's a degraded habitat or a high quality habitat, there is functional value that we are getting of that habitat being in place. And I think, again, we need to be humble about what we know about a piece of land before the new owner is actually had possession of that property. We've heard time and again from all of our partners that the first 5 years of an acquisition, you're going to learn a lot. We are getting, if nothing else, we get from the partners a commitment to sit humbly and observe and reflect, to meet with neighbors and learn the processes and the cycles of the land. That's a great gift to the long-term viability of that property, and to all of us as they develop plans over time to adapt to what they're finding out about those properties. So I would rather come in, as you were saying, have a very adaptive plan in place, but is a commitment to all of us that they're going to simply sit and study and assess and report back to us on what their findings are on a regular basis.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Just because all of this is such an easy task for staff, I just wanted to pile on a little more. No, but it is tremendously, it's a remarkable challenge. So really appreciate all the expertise and insights. One of the things following on Dan's comment and Russ's as well to a certain degree about the flexibility and adaptability, which absolutely makes sense in the request for our partners, and there's so many unknowns, it's required. I think one of the things we also have to be able to argue when we go forward is passing the test of equal access and non-bias. And I raise this, it is something, if it's an uncomfortable conversation, it's an uncomfortable conversation. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't have that conversation now, it will be a 10 times more uncomfortable conversation when a project is challenged or at that point. So us doing our due diligence to show that we have put a thought process around that so we can stand up to that test with more limited resources, public resources, that will become a greater and greater, not just test, but expectation, and really open the agency up for vulnerability. And I think it would be tragic if we set up a remarkable organization such as this for attacks and undermining that could harm funding going forward. Again, I know this is an uncomfortable conversation, but that is a test that I think is before us, and we will be held to that test. And I wouldn't be recognizing my fiduciary responsibility not to raise it. It's not personal. It's not. It's a difficult conversation, but it's a test we're going to have to meet with these new requirements.
Jamie, just for a point of clarification, when you're talking about equal access, you're talking about to the OWEB funding itself.
To the funding, yeah.
Okay. Just because we're talking about access and land and uses, I just, I remember I'm not the brightest bulb on the tree, so I need all the help I can get with clarifying. Go ahead, Sarah.
I'll be brief. I see Mark's hand up. I do also want to note that we're having the discussion we were planning to have later in the meeting, so you guys shouldn't feel like you're behind the agenda because we're just kind of schmearing it all together, and that's totally fine. I will say, I think Dan and Russ, your comments really focus on the management planning step. I think that's totally appropriate. I think it is a real kind of nexus of a lot of what we're hearing lives there. And I think it's part of what we want to take really seriously from partner comments, and is going to take some untangling, because we think we're doing what you're describing to a greater degree than grantees are experiencing it or describing it, right? And so I'm not saying that we're right and they're wrong at all. I'm saying we need to pick that apart and really understand what's creating the feeling that those are our expectations, because we're not requiring a management plan in order to come through the door. We are allowing an interim management plan while, as Russ said, the grantee kind of sits with the property and figures out what a decent long-term trajectory. We do have space for amending management plans. So it's probably in the sort of day-to-day nature and sort of the tone and culture of how we're passing those things back and forth. And that doesn't give us the luxury to say oh, we'll just fix this in rule or statute, or we'll fix this even in program guidance. So I do just want to be clear, and in part just to kind of support our staff, that we're not actually disagreeing with anything that you're saying. It's just that our rules and our guidance would suggest that we're already providing a lot of that opportunity. And so if that's not what folks are experiencing, it's a little bit more of a nuanced and challenging problem to solve. But I do think even if we can get this kind of direction written from the board, look at if we need to update that ecological priorities document, which is, what was it, 2004, that we really are still using a lot even in our review team conversation the other day. Those are, then I think that we can continue that nuts and bolts dialogue with applicants and grantees to be able to say, your board said you should do it this way, and it doesn't feel like that right now. Okay, so that's we can find exactly where the rub is in that conversation. So I guess I both want to sort of say, I think we have been assuming that we're doing what you're describing. And we take grantee feedback very seriously. And so we know that's not the experience that's coming across on the other end. But I don't want you to think we don't get what you're saying. Like, we're not saying that you should come in with a detailed management plan before we'll fund you and then you can never change it. So if it feels like that, we still need to fix it. I don't debate the facts of what, grantees are describing their experience. It's just, I don't think it would be a credit to staff to just say, like, to let you assume that we don't understand that's the way that we should be running the program and the grantee experience that we're aiming for. And I encourage you to help us document that so that our partners can have accountability around that and let us know when we're not living up to that.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And now I am more confused about.
It's harder than it's even harder
than
than
what
you
is the
thought.
problem, man? I don't get what the problem is.
I think it feels more restrictive from the applicant's end than we think it feels like from our end, which I think is a really common problem in public service, right? Like when the government comes and tells you that you could, should, or would be doing something, and and it could be just really like nuanced in the tone of the conversation and email, and I don't know, but I do think that's been a really common thread when we followed up with grantees on the sort of case studies that they shared in public comments and in previous meetings, where it was like, well, this is how we saw it. Like, that sounds like that's not how you saw it. And when we have a really robust, detailed discussion that frankly is pretty hard to have in a public meeting, then what we hear back, and then we're just like, oh yeah, no, I can see how it felt like we were requiring something that maybe our program guidance didn't, wouldn't suggest that we would be requiring, but this narrative kind of builds on itself over time too. And so I do think that just by having this conversation with you guys in a public meeting, clarifying what our program guidance and our statute and role actually direct us to do, and having this conversation about the nature of how we want the grantee experience to feel. Like, I don't want to say we've solved the problem by discussing it, but I think we've actually set ourselves pretty far along the road by having a frank discussion about it.
Sarah, does that so that's really helpful for me. And I'm wondering, like, so the other piece of it is how that's all tied together, right? It's how much of that kind of management stuff gets built into the CE. I mean, and we've talked about that, at length about whether or not to Renee's point earlier, there's very specific risks that we can mitigate, the future sale of the land stuff, and it's pretty easy to kind of put all that stuff into the CE or whatever, and nobody seems to be disagreeing with that part of it. And I thought the problem was a super large lift on the management plan side. And I'm hearing you say that there's a lot of flexibility there, and maybe it's just a communication thing.
Well, I don't know. I think I think all I can say is I agree that part of what I seem to be hearing from public comment and from grantee stories is that the management plan experience is not what we thought it was. To develop that, to amend it, to whatever. And I think, that's just where we'll have to do more digging. But it's, where people are feeling frustrations, it's extremely helpful to know precisely where in the process that is, so that we can watch for it in the future and we can think about, okay, what could we sort of add to guidance to make it clear that that should be a collaborative process. And like I said, then we can welcome accountability if we're not living up to that. But shoot, I had a really good point to make and I forgot it. So why don't you go to Renee and I'll see if I can remember it.
Well, when you remember, you just chime in with it. Go ahead, Renee.
Renee, then Mark.
Yeah. So a few things. One, we will test drive some of this at the April board meeting in the form of, we expect to develop a much shorter, smaller slate of funding conditions for projects as an example. And this is going to be a test of, I think, Dan, kind of the adaptive management approach. Like, we're not identifying every potential issue up front, for example, in the project soundness category. we will embark on due diligence for funded projects. We will have less prescriptive or detailed information and funding conditions, and that will require two-way communication, adaptive management as things come up. So I think we will soon enough have some test cases on adaptive management, not where you're talking about in terms of management plan. I do think that it's going to be really important as an outcome of the direction from the board. Ultimately, we need to have an internal and external team to talk through, like, where are the best points of intervention? Because while we have management plan guidance, and it lines out the minimum requirements, and if that feels really detailed or unreasonable in terms of a certain time frame, whatever the case is, we have to, I think, to Sarah's point, like, kind of crack that open and talk through then what would be a better approach, because we're not on the same page in terms of what we believe is there relative to what grantees are feeling. So we need some spaces to just talk through, like, what is that compromise space that would adaptively manage the adaptive management tool plan. So I think there are some of those pieces that, again, it's kind of getting to the best point of intervention. And that could maybe be true with the conservation easement template. I'm sensitive to, Miriam described in one of the past processes, we went to a fairly pared down conservation easement template from something that was longer and more detailed. And I know some other funders still have that, but if there are pieces where still there is something that's creating a rub, we need to be able to talk through that. Yeah, so just a few thoughts. I don't know, Sarah, if that bought you enough time to remember what you were going to say.
You just did a much better job of saying what I was thinking. So that was actually it. We got examples coming.
All right, Mark.
Yeah, so this question is for any of the OWEB staff. My sense, listening to the land trust community, for example, and then trying to work through the OWEB process. I mean, I haven't applied, but just looking at the templates and thinking about what I would put into there, and then seeing examples provided for this committee. I mean, the management plan does strike me as overly prescriptive. And I don't know that that's the case, but that's just my feeling. And I'm hearing Sarah, for example, say that's maybe not the case. And I say it's prescriptive because it's telling us, or it's listing a number of things, mostly describing what we can't do, which is fairly extensive, as opposed to what we can do, and why I keep coming back to in this whole conversation, and why I think stipulating or describing desired future conditions, regardless of the property, is really important. Because if you describe those desired future conditions, you can essentially say any activities permitted that's consistent with or facilitates the maintenance of these. I mean, that's wide open. It's much less prescriptive. I don't know if legally you can do that, but I am sympathetic to the criticism that the management plan, and haven't done it, haven't read a lot of them, is overly prescriptive. And I'm just trying to understand why y'all don't think that's the case, and the land trust company folks do. And then I keep coming back again, repeating myself to this. For my work in Grant County on the Malheur, we made progress when we started asking, what does this landscape need? And it could be more or less. And the science is pretty clear about that for fire adapted dry side Eastern Oregon. Once you have that desired future condition, it's just pretty wide open what you can do to improve it or maintain it. And so I'm just wondering if that isn't a way to think about this. That's how I'm wanting to think about it.
I think what I'm hearing in terms of next steps is that I don't know that the board committee wants to really get into the weeds of the management plan, no pun intended. But I think, I mean, I take a clear kind of temperature of the committee here is like, let's have staff crack that open and think a little bit more about it, learn a little bit more about it. I haven't looked at any in detail, so I don't know. I don't really have an opinion about it at all, Mark, personally, but I do remember, I I think it was Lawrence Schwalbe on our tribal panel saying that, with another funder, they saw management plans as like, hey, here's what we think we're going to do for the next 5 to 10 years. It might or might not work, but this, just so you know, this is kind of the direction that we're heading, and then have a regular check-in to kind of say, hey, how's it going? What else has evolved, so that we can sort of update management plan, when it makes sense. And I think that's the kind of shoulder to shoulder experience that maybe we're looking for in terms of tone here, based on kind of feedback that we've gotten from grantees. And I don't know of any reason that we can't. We don't know why it doesn't feel like that right now. So we'll just need to dig a little bit deeper. But I think you're right. It could be the level of detail in the plan. It could be that something that we're doing is creating a sense that we think it's more binding than our rules would suggest that we should think it is. And so we need to dig deeper in that. And so that's, I feel like, a really helpful learning from this conversation, is that that's something we need to pursue a little further and kind of work into an eventual recommendation.
So I have a quick recommendation here before we get into recommended refinements. I'm not sure if we have how many of the public commenters we had earlier, but perhaps, Sarah, to your point about having to dig in further, if we could invite maybe Joe or Kristen to speak to their observations for a couple of minutes, to see if we're covering the topics from their perspective.
Russ, I think that's probably up to the co-chairs. I would say that would be a pretty unusual thing for us to do as outside of public comment structure. I'd prefer to bring it back as a panel in a future conversation if we feel like we need some course correction.
All right. Well, I noticed that we didn't.
I was gonna say the exact same thing, because I know that you guys are in the middle of presenting a whole bunch more material to us, and we just sort of hijack this for the discussion.
Yeah, actually, Renee, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that we were pretty close to where we would pivot over to the prompts that were supposed to get you to this discussion. And then the only thing we had after that was to start talking about kind of the structure of what a recommendation might look like. And so if you guys want to sort of finish and close out the substantive, what do we think about the habitat conditions questions? You did that perfectly well without me putting the prompt slide up. Then you can maybe just let us know when you're ready to come back. And we had some ideas that Renee pulled together about kind of how we might continue working towards a recommendation. What did I miss though, Renee?
Yeah, the one piece from that slide, and I think I'm hearing a diversity of opinions on this, is acquisition for acquisition's sake versus being clear on, if we're investing in an acquisition project, is there an expectation of something more, and whether that is in the form of description of restored conditions that formally is incorporated into an easement. But I still think I'm hearing some different comments from different committee members on that topic.
Mark, go ahead while we're taking a look at this slide.
Yeah, I was going to address Russ's request first. I don't know that hearing from just a couple land trust folks will be helpful, because I've talked to some land trust folks who feel like the management plan isn't their problem because they've got a good template, and others are pretty gripey about it. So unless we talk to everybody, I don't know how helpful that would be here.
That's fine.
Yeah. In terms of what Renee just brought up, I have a lot of problem with acquisition for acquisition's sake, but it's only because I think there should be a decision tree there. Acquisition, yes, no, why? I mean, if it's a relatively ecologically appropriately functioning landscape, acquisition for the own sake is good. So I don't see how we get away from ecologically sort of functioning processes and the like for any evaluation. And then given that existing to desired future conditions, that stuff starts to take shape. But acquisition for acquisition sake without additional caveats or qualification is for me a non-starter.
And I would say I'm not a voting board member, but I would 100% agree with what Mark just said. Acquisition for acquisition's sake is I mean, no, thank you, please. As a taxpayer and a lottery player, by the way, just to set the record
You
straight.
truly are an OWEB supporter, Dan.
But I don't know how to get to that value add for this particular acquisition, right? It seems like there needs to be a way to say acquisition because of this potential or because it exists now, right? And so, acquisition because there's a lot of smart people out there who think that this is a good piece of land to buy for X, Y, and Z habitat reasons. And I hate to say it, but it's like that sales pitch, if you will, needs to come in with the project. And if it ain't good enough, then it's not going to get funded, in my opinion. I mean, I think our expert review committee is going to be smart enough to say, yeah, this is acquisition for acquisition's sake. No, thank you, please. Or they're going to say, yeah, this is acquisition with some foresight and thinking about, as Mark said, kind of what this land needs to come back and restore things. And Diane's going to tell us that everything we're talking about is completely illegal. But nonetheless, I think that's the end goal, man. I think we have some ideas about what the end goal is, and we're just going to need some creative legal advice from Diane on how to get there.
Kelly, you had a comment? Then we'll get to Diane.
Yeah, I'd actually like to defer to Diane first before I have my comment.
Okay, sure. Diane, you're up. Welcome.
Thank you, chairs, members of the committee. And I'm reluctant to raise my hand. I just want to make a quick point, given this conversation that folks were just having. And so we've talked about, duty. I want to be clear that the duty is to voters, and when we're implementing a ballot measure, to all voters, that's what we're coming back to. And obviously the case here, voters enacted Measure 76 that amended the Constitution, and in regards to acquisitions, provides that there is the requirement to secure long-term protections for land or water that provide significant habitats. And so significant habitats for native fish and wildlife. So that language was shared earlier, but I think, just the duty to meet that language puts this committee and the board in the situation where there certainly cannot be acquisition for acquisition's sake. So just wanted to make that point.
Good point. Thanks for keeping us in line. And as any good lawyer would say, you can interpret significant habitat to be that for a failed mouse, which would be doing pretty well in a field that is, looking like it's significantly degraded habitat. It's not as far as the mouse is concerned.
Kelly, now your question or comment.
Thanks. Could you put up the question prompts again, please?
Do you see them? I have them
Yes.
up. Okay,
Yes.
I
good.
do.
I couldn't
I'm
tell if
just-
you were reading them or if I hadn't actually shown them yet.
No, I'm reading them and I'm digesting a little bit. I'm struggling a bit with how I think, yes, it would be more helpful to more clearly define significant habitat. But I also feel like there's still a certain amount of requirements under Measure 76, the language in Measure 76 the legal bounds around Measure 76 and then the interpretation of this. And I think that, I mean, I don't feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe things have just been weeded out, but I don't feel like people are proposing things just for acquisition's sake. Everything that I've seen come to the board has been something that would have a real benefit for species, right, and their habitats. So I feel like defining the significant habitat that's pretty nuanced, and that's kind of a tough one to tackle, right? And to Dan's point, you know, it depends on the species and what we're going for there. I also think it's going to be really hard for us to have a proactive restoration requirement for some grants, but not all grants, unless we very, very clearly define that. Because someone could submit an acquisition that doesn't have a proactive restoration requirement for it, staff could review it and interpret it differently, right? So I think it's going to be hard to have that proactive requirement for some, but not all. I want us to be very flexible with things, but I also feel like it may get kind of difficult for us to be flexible and still be equitable with our reviews and with funding that's given for different acquisitions. And then I think that the accountability of public funds and flexibility, there's a lot of sticking points for me here. I want to have solutions that I can propose, but I'm really struggling to find those solutions in this moment simply because it is such a delicate balance of the flexibility and the ability to respond to changing conditions. I also very much want to, I've been kind of quiet this meeting because I've been digesting a lot and thinking through things. And I really want to thank the public commenters. And again, I want to thank our tribal panel that we had in December, because I think they brought up a lot of good points with getting folks onto the landscape, connected to the landscape, and the folks being a part of the landscape and a part of the restoration work that happens on the landscape. And I think that's a huge piece to this as well. And I also think, you know, striking that balance with, you know, restoration and habitat, but getting folks out on the landscape, for example, like tribal members that potentially want to go and gather somewhere, but it's our tribal elders and we need to have facilities for them or somewhere that's shaded for them to sit. So we may have to put some kind of structure or something on the land that may not fit into a restoration type plan, but it's something that we would need to get our membership out onto the landscape, or even community members, you know, taking it broadly, you know, not just tribes, but community members out on the lands, helping to manage restoration projects, you know, getting in there, harvesting, you know, part of managing restoration projects for tribes is actually getting out and doing the active management and doing the harvesting of it, right? To help restore them. And so it's really like, I'm just struggling right now with the nuance of things, but I've got everything swirling around in my head. And I can't grab onto something and go, you guys, this is what we should do, and this is going to fix it. So
if it comes to you in the middle of the night, Kelly, let us know. But I do
I
want
will
to
write a
share, like,
note.
I think this conversation is just enormously helpful. Like, you guys don't have to like just kind of spoon feed us solutions. It's great when you can. But this kind of sense of the board and how people are thinking about, how members are thinking about these issues is like, I feel like we can go back and start crafting draft proposed recommendations that you can then kind of tell us where we need to course correct. But I I want to reassure you that the swirling is actually really helpful.
So to those points, I guess to Renee and to Sarah, if you think about the written comments we had today from Joe, Mark with a K and Mark with a C, and the very helpful tribal partners panel that we had, what is jumping out for you as the perspectives, as the priority perspectives coming out of the partners that we're hearing from in terms of specific recommendations?
Renee, I noticed that you are not immediately unmuting, but I would welcome you to go first.
Well, Russ, I'm going to answer that, but also hark back to something that Kelly said. So Kelly, I agree that we rarely see come in the door something that doesn't have a habitat benefit. I think part of what, and this, Russ, goes to your suggestion, like what I would like to see come out of this is kind of a different lens on the program, such that if I can't remember which public comment letter, maybe it was Joe Buttafuoco's, talking about kind of it's almost a chicken and egg, where you've got this loop of, it feels as though we need to be able to make commitments to signal the really significant nature of that habitat if it's not already sitting there right now. And then if something plays out and we're not hitting a timeline, then you add another requirement. Like, I would like us to encourage all applicants to come in and say, like, tell us the authentic story. What is the condition now? What do you aim to achieve with this? Over what time horizon? Which of those 7 conservation biology principles that we have in that 2004 document that still hold? Conservation biology has not changed. Some of the drivers impacting our environment have changed, but how do you meet that and try to pull back on some of what maybe folks are intending as aspirational, but they seem more concrete than they may have a sense of when they're just embarking on a project. So that's one thing that, I would like us to pull a handle on. I think, Kelly, to your point, that other uses issue it's huge, and we do have time in June to talk about it, because that's a big consideration. And whether you're talking about cultural uses, recreational uses, given societal expectations that are different maybe from what they were back in 1998, working land. So I think that conversation is going to be really important. Russ, I would say to your point also, taking a look at Sarah, as Sarah mentioned, the management plan, thinking about, are there some of those pieces even related to like how prohibited uses are structured? I think just generally looking at the easement template to understand, are we unintentionally introducing rigidity into something, and being able to have an open conversation about that. So those are just a few thoughts. Sarah, hopefully you have some better ones than that.
No, that's, I think, really solid. And I think that thread that you described makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm a former OWEB, grant applicant, although not in this program. And I will say, like, grant applications are optimistic. That's kind of how it works. Like, when you present what Dan described as a sales pitch, you would be nuts to kind of find a, best mediocre case scenario and put that in your application. And so if we are expecting to hold folks to something that was, maybe not aspirational, maybe not a sales pitch, but was maybe kind of optimistic, because we want the project to be competitive. We want our best wishes to come true. If we hold folks to kind of the XYZ of that over the course of a couple decades, we're going to be pretty disappointed. And I think it's in the dialogue in between those steps that, like, we can work on the easement template, we can work on the management plan, we can look at how we can make those like a simple tool to support a conversation rather than sort of a document that stands by itself. And I think that's part of what I hear in private conversations with grantees, is it's like, if that can be a tool for documenting a shared understanding that we actually have, as opposed to what feels like maybe a binding legal document. I mean, the easement obviously is binding, but things will not go according to the most optimistic case. So we shouldn't manage for that, and we can't really ask grantees to be a lot less optimistic than they're going to be in an application cycle, because that's kind of how you do business. But then I think what do we do, Dan, to your point, when the sales pitch that we make an award based on, like what's the level of departure from that proposed, future reality that we should tolerate, feel comfortable with? Do we feel like that risk is actually like, hey, you said you were going to do this, and it's not my problem if you do or not? Or, how should we be working productively and collaboratively with grantees to keep ourselves reasonably close to that? What do we do when something really, really different happens? Like really different. And then of course, how do we deal with the space in between? Because there is, usually a lot of habitat benefit and legitimate disagreement about what's an acceptable level of impact to that habitat benefit. Or a significant, or a reasonable level of uplift. So that's, yeah, it seems clear in your mind when you start to say it, huh, Renee? And then a lot of words come out. But I think that my key take home is, how can we use this as a tool to a good collaborative relationship, and with clear shared expectations, as opposed to a legal document? And how do we present a customer service experience that makes it feel that way and still be a good, accountable public funder? That's the balance that we need to strike. And I think our grantees recognize the challenge of doing that.
So Dan, you had some comments?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Sarah. I was trying to get this in before you stopped sharing your screen with
Oh,
Lois.
I just feel bad because I know people can't see as well. I'm fine because I got another screen, but I'll bring it back up. That's okay.
Because it helped. I'm wondering, seeing this, and thank you, Kelly, for asking them to show these again. The third bullet here, in particular, does not sound like a shoulder-to-shoulder experience to me, right? It sounds like a little bit of a passing the buck on risk, right? When we start talking about requirements in enforcement, I mean, that's sort of what EPA does, right? But I don't think OWEB needs to do that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I don't know what Diane thinks about this, but this is sort of, to me, where maybe we're having some problems. And so it's, to your point, Sarah, it's like, yeah, if there's a vision to get to a certain space, right? What happens if we don't get there? That's kind of what we're ultimately talking about. And that's where I feel like, again, it's sort of, not to, again, pass the buck to the review committee, but it's sort of like, we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from ground zero to where I am now, which is maybe just, a couple inches off the ground. But there's a lot of our partners, and not to take away from Jamie's point about being equitable, and we're not just funding land trusts. We're funding anybody who has a credible story, right? To come in and tell us how they can get stuff done that's going to benefit habitat, ultimately. And some of those people have potentially inherently lower risk because of their 50C3 status. I forget that architecture we talked about, but there's a land trust sort of accreditation thing, right? So there's like some ingrained built-in kind of risk mitigation for some of the people we're going to fund, not all. I've never, and Mark did much more homework on this than I did in terms of kind of reading through the application and thinking about what you would actually submit. But I tell you, I'd get pretty nervous about seeing something that says I'm required to do this and there's some kind of an enforcement of it. When I have no idea if it's actually going to be successful, but even before that, whether or not I'm going to be able to get some funding on the ground to get it done. So that seems like maybe this is kind of one of the rub points.
Yeah, Dan, if I can just quickly reframe what you're describing as a different question we could be asking maybe more productively here. It's like, is a compliance enforcement approach ever appropriate for a proactive restoration requirement or is a requirement? It's one thing to set out an aspirational restoration goal. Should we ever be in that compliance enforcement requiring space related to? And I just want to remind folks, I kind of edge towards Dan's perspective personally, but the reason we got here was because I think, if Renee and Miriam don't tell me I'm wrong, that we were trying to make space for significantly impacted habitat to be more involved in the program. Like, the goal was to make space originally for something that might not be significant habitat today, but had potential to get there. And that's it's almost kind of ironic that I think that's where we started, was to try to make more space for a potential future condition to be considered. And if it feels, like a compliance enforcement problem now, that maybe causes us to reconsider the framing. Sorry. Now I said more than I meant, Russ. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You were in line.
Mark, why don't you go next? There you go.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I disagree with Dan, but let me just put it from a private landowner perspective. If you were to give me a $4 million property with the expectation just to improve it, I would be tickled to death. Now, I would be apprehensive about getting the requisite funds, and that would be a lot more apprehensive, say, about an estuary project than I am about an Eastern Oregon project. So I think that's the land trust game. I think they need to expect that, and it's reasonable of us to have expectations. The way you might rephrase that, how do we consider documenting or enforcing it? Probably the shoulder to shoulder view would be, how do we help ensure that happens? So framing that differently. But I'm having sometimes trouble feeling very sorry for the land trust community. And I just want to be frank about this, because you're being given an incredible opportunity at no cost. And so I think it's a reasonable expectation that you take on certain obligations and commitments. And that's going to be a function of the quality of the landscape or habitat OWEB purchases for you, and that you helped match. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that there are expectations here, public dollars, public benefit. So the question is how to describe it, to frame it, and to help it to be successful. And I don't know that Dan disagrees with this, but I was disagreeing with how Dan was phrasing it.
Yeah.
There's risk here that's ineliminable. You cannot get rid of it. But what we want to ask is, how do we help this entire process be successful? And I do think reorienting or reconfiguring how OWEB does some of this or communicates it, being clear about why the land trust community, for example, doesn't feel that's happening. Those are all things that we should address and pursue. But this is an incredible opportunity for folks. I wished I was a nonprofit that had this opportunity. So I don't play the lottery, but as a private landowner, the cost it took me to get into a property and to also sort of improve that property, that's a heavy lift. And I think land trusts have quite a benefit because they don't have to purchase the property. So anyway, I just want to be clear about that. We're not trying to eliminate risk. We're trying to make it so that this program is successful and people are happy with it. Or not happy, but feel like they can share in that contentment and the like.
Renee.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify one thing that Sarah said, and Miriam, feel free to correct me if I misstate some of this. So some of the restoration requirement was also due to, in particular, with a handful of very early projects where a grant, we helped to provide some acquisition funding. A grantee said, we know this isn't in great shape now. We will be turning this around. We will be creating more significant habitat. And I'm not going to say all, but several of those did not involve accredited entities. And they walked away from that expectation. And so the agency, in looking at tools that it had available, said, let's go ahead. And if you're coming in with that kind of a project, then we will build in a restoration requirement and capture it in the form of description of restored condition. So that was the other piece. It wasn't just creating space, but it was really trying to reverse engineer some things that didn't go great. That happens a lot less now. Can it still happen? Yes, it can still happen. But I think that Jamie, asked, like, what are some of the learnings? Well, that's a great example of one of the learnings through time. I think now is the question of, like, how is some of that stacking of let's avoid this, let's avoid that? Like, we need to talk about that with you all as a committee and the full board around, is that important to you? Is that too much? Where do you think those key pieces are to ensure that we can deliver on the intent of those Measure 76 dollars that have been allocated to a project?
So I have a recommendation at this point based upon the rich input we've been getting to this point. I just feel that we are so close to having really ripe recommendations in terms of refinements going forward that I would urge that we consider the idea of a very active work session between the staff and the tribal and land trust community now to acknowledge all the comments that we've had and to come up with, have them part of an active work session to help us refine the recommendations as we're moving forward. I don't think it's going to take an extraordinary amount of time, but I think if you had a 3 to 4 hour work session, that we would get a significant leap forward with tangible recommendations that we could all embrace.
Russ, what would you think about potentially postponing that until we have some draft recommendations to ask for feedback on, kind of based on board discussion? We had talked a little bit too, Renee reminded me this morning about potentially doing a survey of board members, which allows us to make some progress between public meetings as long as we're not sharing the results with you in between public meetings. To say, like, okay, here's some key questions that we don't think we quite got to consensus on. What do you think? And that would allow us to work towards, I feel like we're approaching the point, we still have, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of our next steps. We still have, access and use topic to get to, but we've been documenting kind of take homes at each of these steps. And I feel like we're not far from where we could start to draft up a kind of straw man document. And then maybe it is I have trouble picturing a productive work session with the 30 or 40 people that you just described, Russ. So maybe it's several work sessions, maybe it's some public, maybe it's a survey and then a work session, maybe it's a survey and then comments on a draft or something like that. But I feel like having something written to provide feedback on might help that be a more productive forum.
I think that's a fine compromise there. I do think that it's an acknowledgement that the staff has heard really clearly from the collaborative partners throughout this process, but I do think that my sense is that we're really close to a unifying, collaborative set of recommendations. And I would like to suggest that we just give them time to have a rich dialogue with the staff and to put our best foot forward with the expertise that we're really fortunate to have at the table with us. So if you want to go through step one of coming up with a suite of draft ideas, I think that would be great.
Yeah, and as you know, Russ, we've been doing kind of some intermittent listening sessions with Coalition of Oregon Land Trust members, and so that, you know, that's something that we could reconvene around a draft document for sure.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I see Mark Webb has a hand up. Mark, you want to?
Yeah, so 2 requests. One is that I think that's a great suggestion. What I want to say, so the only practitioners in this conversation are not the land trust, they are the OWEB staff. I continue to feel that Miriam, Renee, Sarah, and others have a good sense of changes we need to make. I really want to hear from you all what changes you think would help facilitate this effort and address land trust and others' concerns. I mean, just today, there were clarifications which I've been operating under a different set of assumptions and the like, which made a world of difference. So I would appreciate hearing from you all. And I really want to press that. And then secondly, any set of recommendations that you all are hearing and might draft for us, my conviction is that if they're the best ones, they're going to address the next 2 or 3 topics we talk about, because they really are going to focus on significant habitat, what landscape needs are, what expectations around restoration and management are there or not, because the acquisition is going to be good regardless. And that's going to give us a sense around access, what types of access or use are appropriate. And as I've shared, sometimes I really feel like this is going to help address the indigenous concern about accessing lands in a way that's culturally rich and resonant. And so, yeah, just to say that I think if you get the suggestions from us that you think you're hearing, they should address those other issues as well. And I want to hear from you all. So that is a specific request. I don't want to be put off anymore.
Mark, what would be the best format to do that in? Because I think we do that with our slides to a significant degree, to tell you the truth. And I think I just heard you say that it helped today.
I don't think
you're right. It's factual, not recommendation. So we could, instead of drafting a memo.
How would you change the system that you currently implement?
Well,
now, I don't know
one
if
possibility is
Dan
that the
and
3 of
Russ-
us don't agree about that, but go ahead, sorry.
I think we need to hear that because y'all are practitioners in this. And I appreciate it's our decision. But personally, it frustrates me to no end to be in a position to make a decision about something that I'm not an expert in and I don't have a lot of experience or practice with. And so what y'all might propose is not something I would necessarily agree with, but I would respect it in a way that the silence now is pretty frustrating.
Okay, I
don't think
appreciate that,
I just want to say, I don't think what Mark is asking for is different from what you offered a moment ago, Sarah, in response to Ruth.
Yeah, I almost wondered if it would help if we just write something like what I just described, but frame it up as a staff recommendation rather than us trying to draft a board recommendation and then have you guys tell us where it's wrong. Like, would it help if we work towards a document that's not a straw man of your recommendation to the full board, but that is an actual staff recommendation on each of these?
Thank you.
Sarah, I think we have complete trust that you are going to embrace the information that you've been provided. So yeah.
Okay. Well, Renee, I think had a comment on that before I make any commitments.
Yeah. So
sorry to be pushy,
No,
but I
it's
think
fair.
that will really help move us along.
That's fair.
Yeah. So I do think that there could be some different ideas of what could and should be moved. And I do want to make sure we come back to some of what has been built over the years has been built in response to projects that, like my example from the very early projects, feedback we've heard from the board, input we've gotten from outside interested parties. So I do want to be sensitive to, we need your buy-in on this, because ultimately your direction needs to come to us as the decision makers on funding for how you would like this program to be structured. And I think without some understanding and assurance around, okay, we don't care about these 27 risks all in the same way, Renee, Miriam, Sarah, Robin. We care about these 4 a lot, and we want to give some space for flexibility over here. So I just want to be sensitive to, we absolutely, Mark, can do that. I have no shortage of ideas. And as Miriam is implementing a program on a daily basis, I think that we need to make sure there's some cover of the board is all in on this and shoulder to shoulder if we are pulling off some of the sideboards that we have built over 2 decades of program implementation.
So for me, I appreciate that, and I hope you will share that way.
Renee, thank you. That was really helpful. Jamie, we're at 12 o'clock, so just.
Understood. One point that Sarah raised that I thought was really important is that there may be a difference of perspective and ideas and opinion, even amongst staff. And I would really welcome, I know ultimately there needs to be a final one going forward, but I would really welcome seeing some of that distinction that we could, as Mark mentioned, if we're not experts in certain areas or don't have some of that background that you all have, to be able to delve into that a little bit more. So if it's difference of opinion from what we're hearing from the public, if amongst staff there's different perspectives, I would find that a really rich part of that discussion. So it's not just staff gets together, arm wrestles, comes up with one recommendation, that's what comes forward. It really is a sense of a range of the different perspectives on opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we promise to avoid arm wrestling. I think we can do this. It might look different from what we described now, but we'll play around with it. I'm thinking about how to respond to Renee's point, and I think we can guess on a lot what kind of high level guidance he would give us that this should be responding to, right? So I think this gets to what Jamie's suggesting. Maybe if we said, hey, if the board wants us to move the program in this direction, sort of philosophically or directionally, here are some options and some considerations according to those options. And we think 1, 2, and 3 are a really good idea. 4, 5, and 6 make us super nervous, something like that. That's a heck of a lot of work. So we'll get started on it and, start chipping away and see what we can bring you. But I do want to sort of reassure Mark that we've been figuring it out while you guys have been too, to a significant degree. So it's not that there was a right answer that we knew all along and we just refused to tell you it. Like it's been a discovery.
I don't know. I
process
think
for us
y'all
too.
knew, and you're just being deferential to the board.
Yeah, I knew what the right answer was all along, and now I'll tell you what rock to bring. No, I mean it has been a real evolution in thinking, for us too. And so I don't want you to think we've been hiding the ball on you here.
I think you've understood that streamlining requires a adjustment to the acknowledgement of trust and risk management all along. And now you have the tangible inputs from a lot of partners to help deliver a suite of draft staff recommendations that incorporates the input from all the partners you've heard from. Again, I just hope that in the feedback process here, that we not only come up with a suite of draft staff recommendations for the committee and the board to consider, but also to have time for the partners to be able to, through a work session of some type, to chew on the draft recommendations and give you their input to make sure that we're in fact incorporating their perspectives fully.
Yep, we'll be in touch with Colt and certainly with the tribal government partners that we worked with for the panel to, to think about what's the right. That doesn't all have to fit in public comment for sure, but we should be structured and and equitable in how we provide that opportunity and transparent in how we provide that opportunity. So we'll start. I have this weird feeling that I just agreed to write a dissertation on behalf of our team, and I'm a little nervous about that. But we do have a monthly meeting with co-chairs, and so that gives us some time to sort of work on what a structure might look like, request some feedback, maybe bring some early work to you at our next meeting and continue to work on it.
Okay, last
Gotta go,
comment by Mark
folks.
Webb.
Yeah, I don't structure. Why don't you just answer the 4 questions that we're talking about?
Maybe. We got to try it.
And I do want to hear from you all. I appreciate engaging with Land Trust, the tribes, and other partners. I do want to hear from y'all your own perspective. I appreciate that can be tempered, but I do want to hear what y'all are thinking qua OWEB staff.
Okay. Direction received.
Other comments before we call it a day?
April board meeting, we'll do a similar presentation of just here's the additional comment that we heard, the additional information we shared, kind of a substantive update, but not recommendations out of this committee. So we'll support the co-chairs in communicating some more substance than usually fits in a committee update, similar to last time.
Okay, so to Mark's point, timeline as to when you think you could get back to us with the draft staff comments and recommendations.
I think the best we can do is say, let us work on it and see if there's a part of a draft that we could bring to the June meeting. I mean, you're describing something that could be years worth of work if we did it right. So we're going to have to find the right level and bring you our work midstream in June and ask about it.
Okay, fair enough. Other comments before we call it a day?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think this can be really high level. I don't know why. I mean, I know y'all are incredibly busy. I feel bad about putting additional stuff on your plate. But I don't know that for me, you need to put as much work into this as y'all would typically put stuff in. It seems like you could get a range of answers to the 4 questions that would help frame how you think we should approach things in the future as a foil for us to consider. So I don't want you to, what I would say, overdo it, but maybe I'm unfair to y'all.
You have seen how it's very onion-like in its nature, right? Like you start and then it peels back and it peels back and then everybody's weeping. And
I think y'all gravitate to process and content.
We'll be careful. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for your input, and apologize for going over.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.